Now reading The Monk, a romance by M.G. Matthew Gregory Lewis, a public domain text. Chapter 7. Ah, how dark these long-extended realms and rueful wastes, where naught but silence reigns, and night, dark as was chaos ere the infant sun was rolled together, or had tried its beams athwart the gloom profound. The sickly taper, by glimmering through thy low-browed misty vaults, furred round with mouldy damps and ropey slime, lets fall a supernumerary horror, and only serves to make thy night more irksome. Blair. Returned undiscovered to the abbey, Ambrosio's mind was filled with the most pleasing images. He was wilfully blind to the danger of exposing himself to Antonia's charms. He only remembered the pleasure which her society had afforded him, and rejoiced in the prospect of that pleasure being repeated. He failed not to profit by Elvira's indisposition to obtain a sight of her daughter every day. At first he bounded his wishes to inspire Antonia with friendship, but no sooner was he convinced that she felt that sentiment in its fullest extent than his aim became more decided, and his attentions assumed a warmer colour. The innocent familiarity with which she treated him encouraged his desires. Grown used to her modesty, it no longer commanded the same respect and awe. He still admired it, but it only made him more anxious to deprive her of that quality which formed her principal charm. Warmth of passion and natural penetration, of which latter unfortunately both for himself and Antonia he possessed an ample share, supplied a knowledge of the arts of seduction. He easily distinguished the emotions which were favourable to his designs, and seized every means with avidity of infusing corruption into Antonia's bosom. This he found no easy matter. Extreme simplicity prevented her from perceiving the aim to which the monk's insinuations tended, but the excellent morals which she owed to Elvira's care, the solidity and correctness of her understanding, and a strong sense of what was right implanted in her heart by nature, made her feel that his precepts must be faulty. By a few simple words she frequently overthrew the whole bulk of his sophistical arguments, and made him conscious how weak they were when opposed to virtue and truth. On such occasion he took refuge in his eloquence. He overpowered her with a torrent of philosophical paradoxes, to which, not understanding them, it was impossible for her to reply. And thus, though he did not convince her that his reasoning was just, he at least prevented her from discovering it to be false. He perceived that her respect for his judgment augmented daily, and doubted not with time to bring her to the point desired. He was not unconscious that his attempts were highly criminal. He saw clearly the baseness of seducing the innocent girl, but his passion was too violent to permit his abandoning his design. He resolved to pursue it, let the consequences be what they might. He depended upon finding Antonia in some unguarded moment, and seeing no other man admitted into her society, nor hearing any mentioned either by her or by Elvira. He imagined that her young heart was still unoccupied. While he waited for the opportunity of satisfying his unwarrantable lust, every day increased his coldness for Matilda. Not a little was this occasioned by the consciousness of his faults to her. To hide them from her, he was not sufficiently master of himself, yet he dreaded lest, in a transport of jealous rage, she should betray the secret on which his character and even his life depended. Matilda could not but remark his indifference. He was conscious that she remarked it, and fearing her reproaches, shunned her studiously. Yet when he could not avoid her, her mildness might have convinced him that he had nothing to dread from her resentment. She had resumed the character of the gentle, interesting Rosario. She taxed him not with ingratitude, but her eyes filled with involuntary tears, and the soft melancholy of her countenance and voice uttered complaints far more touching than words could have conveyed. Ambrosio was not unmoved by her sorrow, but unable to remove its cause, he forbore to show that it affected him. As her conduct convinced him that he needed not fear her vengeance, he continued to neglect her, and avoided her company with care. Matilda saw that she in vain attempted to regain his affections, yet she stifled the impulse of resentment, and continued to treat her inconstant lover with her former fondness and attention. By degrees, Elvira's constitution recovered itself. She was no longer troubled with convulsions, and Antonia ceased to tremble for her mother. Ambrosio beheld this re-establishment with displeasure. He saw that Elvira's knowledge of the world would not be the dupe of his sanctified demeanour, and that she would easily perceive his views upon her daughter. He resolved, therefore, before she quitted her chamber, to try the extent of his influence over the innocent Antonia. One evening, when he had found Elvira almost perfectly restored to health, he quitted her earlier than was his usual custom. Not finding Antonia in the antechamber, he ventured to follow her to her own. It was only separated from her mother's by a closet, in which Flora, the waiting woman, generally slept. Antonia sat upon a sofa with her back towards the door and read attentively. She heard not his approach, till he had seated himself by her. She started and welcomed him with a look of pleasure. Then rising, she would have conducted him to the sitting-room, but Ambrosio, taking her hand, obliged her by gentle violence to resume her place. She complied without difficulty. She knew not that there was more impropriety in conversing with him in one room than another. She thought herself equally secure of his principles and her own, and having replaced herself upon the sofa, she began to prattle to him with her usual ease and vivacity. He examined the book which she had been reading and had now placed upon the table. It was the Bible. "How," said the friar to himself, "Antonia reads the Bible and is still so ignorant." But upon a further inspection he found that Elvira had made exactly the same remark. That prudent mother, while she admired the beauties of the sacred writings, was convinced that, unrestricted, no reading more improper could be permitted a young woman. Many of the narratives can only tend to excite ideas, the worst calculated for a female breast. Everything is called plainly and roundly by its name, and the annals of a brothel would scarcely furnish a greater choice of indecent expressions. Yet this is the book which young women are recommended to study, which is put into the hands of children, able to comprehend little more than those passages of which they had better remain ignorant, and which but too frequently inculcates the first rudiments of vice, and gives the first alarm to the still sleeping passions. Of this was Elvira so fully convinced, that she would have preferred putting into her daughter's hands Amadis de Gaul, or the valiant champion, Tirant the White, and would sooner have authorized her studying the lewd exploits of Don Galaor, or the lascivious jokes of the damsel Plaza di mi vida. She had in consequence made 2 resolutions respecting the Bible. The first was that Antonia should not read it till she was of an age to feel its beauties, and profit by its morality. The second, that it should be copied out with her own hand, and all improper passages either altered or omitted. She had adhered to this determination, and such was the Bible which Antonia was reading. It had been lately delivered to her, and she perused it with an avidity, with a delight that was inexpressible. Ambrosio perceived his mistake, and replaced the book upon the table. Antonia spoke of her mother's health with all the enthusiastic joy of a youthful heart. "I admire your filial affection," said the abbot. "It proves the excellence and sensibility of your character. It promises a treasure to him whom heaven has destined to possess your affections. The breast, so capable of fondness for a parent, what will it feel for a lover? Nay, perhaps, what feels it for one even now? Tell me, my lovely daughter, have you known what it is to love? Answer me with sincerity, forget my habit, and consider me only as a friend." "What it is to love?" said she, repeating his question. "Oh, yes, undoubtedly, I have loved many, many people. That is not what I mean. The love of which I speak can be felt only for one. Have you never seen the man whom you wish to be your husband?" "Oh, no, indeed." This was an untruth, but she was unconscious of its falsehood. She knew not the nature of her sentiments for Lorenzo, and never having seen him since his first visit to Elvira, with every day his image grew less feebly impressed upon her bosom. Besides, she thought of an husband with all a virgin's terror, and negatived the friar's demand without a moment's hesitation. "And do you not long to see that man, Antonia? Do you feel no void in your heart which you fain would have filled up? Do you heave no sighs for the absence of someone dear to you, but who that someone is you know not? Perceive you not that what formerly could please has charms for you no longer? That 1,000 new wishes, new ideas, new sensations have sprang in your bosom, only to be felt, never to be described? Or while you fill every other heart with passion, is it possible that your own remains insensible and cold? It cannot be. That melting eye, that blushing cheek, that enchanting voluptuous melancholy, which at times overspreads your features, all these marks belie your words. You love, Antonia, and in vain would hide it from me. Father, you amaze me. What is this love of which you speak? I neither know its nature, nor if I felt it, why I should conceal the sentiment. Have you seen no man, Antonia, whom though never seen before, you seem long to have sought? Whose form, though a stranger's, was familiar to your eyes? The sound of whose voice soothed you, pleased you, penetrated to your very soul? In whose presence you rejoiced, for whose absence you lamented? With whom your heart seemed to expand, and in whose bosom with confidence unbounded you reposed the cares of your own. Have you not felt all this, Antonia? Certainly I have. The first time that I saw you, I felt it. Ambrosio started. Scarcely dared he credit his hearing. Me, Antonia? He cried, his eyes sparkling with delight and impatience, while he seized her hand and pressed it rapturously to his lips. Me, Antonia. You felt these sentiments for me. Even with more strength than you have described. The very moment that I beheld you, I felt so pleased, so interested. I waited so eagerly to catch the sound of your voice, and when I heard it, it seemed so sweet. It spoke to me a language till then so unknown, methought. It told me 1,000 things which I wished to hear. It seemed as if I had long known you, as if I had a right to your friendship, your advice, and your protection. I wept when you departed, and longed for the time which should restore you to my sight. Antonia, my charming Antonia, exclaimed the monk, and caught her to his bosom. Can I believe my senses? Repeat it to me, my sweet girl. Tell me again that you love me truly and tenderly. Indeed, I do. Let my mother be accepted, and the world holds no one more dear to me. At this frank avowal, Ambrosio no longer possessed himself. Wild with desire, he clasped the blushing trembler in his arms. He fastened his lips greedily upon hers, sucked in her pure delicious breath, violated with his bold hand the treasures of her bosom, and wound around him her soft and yielding limbs. Startled, alarmed, and confused at his action, surprise at first deprived her of the power of resistance. At length recovering herself, she strove to escape from his embrace. "Father, Ambrosio," she cried, "release me for God's sake." But the licentious monk heeded not her prayers. He persisted in his design, and proceeded to take still greater liberties. Antonia prayed, wept, and struggled, terrified to the extreme, though at what she knew not, she exerted all her strength to repulse the friar, and was on the point of shrieking for assistance when the chamber door was suddenly thrown open. Ambrosio had just sufficient presence of mind to be sensible of his danger. Reluctantly he quitted his prey, and started hastily from the couch. Antonia uttered an exclamation of joy, flew towards the door, and found herself clasped in the arms of her mother. Alarmed at some of the abbot's speeches, which Antonia had innocently repeated, Elvira resolved to ascertain the truth of her suspicions. She had known enough of mankind not to be imposed upon by the monk's reputed virtue. She reflected on several circumstances, which, though trifling, on being put together seemed to authorize her fears. His frequent visits, which, as far as she could see, were confined to her family, his evident emotion, whenever she spoke of Antonia, his being in the full prime and heat of manhood, and above all, his pernicious philosophy communicated to her by Antonia, and which accorded but ill with his conversation in her presence, all these circumstances inspired her with doubts respecting the purity of Ambrosio's friendship. In consequence, she resolved, when he should next be alone with Antonia, to endeavour at surprising him. Her plan had succeeded. 'Tis true that when she entered the room he had already abandoned his prey, but the disorder of her daughter's dress, and the shame and confusion stamped upon the friar's countenance, sufficed to prove that her suspicions were but too well founded. However, she was too prudent to make those suspicions known. She judged that to unmask the impostor would be no easy matter. The public being so much prejudiced in his favour, and having but few friends, she thought it dangerous to make herself so powerful an enemy. She affected therefore not to remark his agitation, seated herself tranquilly upon the sofa, assigned some trifling reason for having quitted her room unexpectedly, and conversed on various subjects with seeming confidence and ease. Reassured by her behaviour, the monk began to recover himself. He strove to answer Elvira without appearing embarrassed, but he was still too great a novice in dissimulation, and he felt that he must look confused and awkward. He soon broke off the conversation and rose to depart. What was his vexation, when on taking leave, Elvira told him in polite terms that being now perfectly re-established, she thought it an injustice to deprive others of his company, who might be more in need of it. She assured him of her eternal gratitude, for the benefit which during her illness she had derived from his society and exhortations, and she lamented that her domestic affairs, as well as the multitude of business which his situation must of necessity impose upon him, would in future deprive her of the pleasure of his visits. Though delivered in the mildest language, this hint was too plain to be mistaken. Still, he was preparing to put in a remonstrance when an expressive look from Elvira stopped him short. He dared not press her to receive him, for her manner convinced him that he was discovered. He submitted without reply, took an hasty leave, and retired to the abbey, his heart filled with rage and shame, with bitterness and disappointment. Antonia's mind felt relieved by his departure, yet she could not help lamenting that she was never to see him more. Elvira also felt a secret sorrow. She had received too much pleasure from thinking him her friend, not to regret the necessity of changing her opinion, but her mind was too much accustomed to the fallacy of worldly friendships to permit her present disappointment to weigh upon it long. She now endeavoured to make her daughter aware of the risk which she had ran, but she was obliged to treat the subject with caution, lest in removing the bandage of ignorance, the veil of innocence should be rent away. She therefore contented herself with warning Antonia to be upon her guard, and ordering her, should the abbot persist in his visits, never to receive them but in company. With this injunction, Antonia promised to comply. Ambrosio hastened to his cell. He closed the door after him, and threw himself upon the bed in despair. The impulse of desire, the stings of disappointment, the shame of detection, and the fear of being publicly unmasked, rendered his bosom a scene of the most horrible confusion. He knew not what course to pursue. Debarred the presence of Antonia, he had no hopes of satisfying that passion which was now become a part of his existence. He reflected that his secret was in a woman's power. He trembled with apprehension when he beheld the precipice before him, and with rage when he thought that had it not been for Elvira, he should now have possessed the object of his desires. With the direct imprecations he vowed vengeance against her. He swore that, cost what it would, he still would possess Antonia. Starting from the bed, he paced the chamber with disordered steps, howled with impotent fury, dashed himself violently against the walls, and indulged all the transports of rage and madness. He was still under the influence of this storm of passions when he heard a gentle knock at the door of his cell. Conscious that his voice must have been heard, he dared not refuse admittance to the importuner. He strove to compose himself and to hide his agitation. Having in some degree succeeded, he drew back the bolt, the door opened, and Matilda appeared. At this precise moment there was no one with whose presence he could better have dispensed. He had not sufficient command over himself to conceal his vexation. He started back and frowned. "I am busy," said he in a stern and hasty tone. "Leave me." Matilda heeded him not. She again fastened the door, and then advanced towards him with an air gentle and supplicating. "Forgive me, Ambrosio," said she. "For your own sake, I must not obey you. Fear no complaints from me. I come not to reproach you with your ingratitude. I pardon you from my heart, and since your love can no longer be mine, I request the next best gift, your confidence and friendship. We cannot force our inclinations. The little beauty which you once saw in me has perished with its novelty, and if it can no longer excite desire, mine is the fault, not yours. But why persist in shunning me? Why such anxiety to fly my presence? You have sorrows, but will not permit me to share them. You have disappointments, but will not accept my comfort. You have wishes, but forbid my aiding your pursuits. 'Tis of this which I complain, not of your indifference to my person. I have given up the claims of the mistress, but nothing shall prevail on me to give up those of the friend." Her mildness had an instantaneous effect upon Ambrosio's feelings. "Generous Matilda," he replied, taking her hand, "how far do you rise superior to the foibles of your sex? Yes, I accept your offer. I have need of an adviser and a confidant. In you I find every needful quality united. But to aid my pursuits, ah, Matilda, it lies not in your power. It lies in no one's power but mine. Ambrosio, your secret is none to me. Your every step, your every action has been observed by my attentive eye. You love." "Matilda?" "Why conceal it from me? Fear not the little jealousy which taints the generality of women. My soul disdains so despicable a passion. You love, Ambrosio. Antonia d'Alfa is the object of your flame. I know every circumstance respecting your passion. Every conversation has been repeated to me. I have been informed of your attempt to enjoy Antonia's person, your disappointment and dismission from Elvira's house. You now despair of possessing your mistress, but I come to revive your hopes and point out the road to success." "To success? Oh, impossible!" "To them who dare nothing is impossible. Rely upon me, and you may yet be happy. The time is come, Ambrosio, when regard for your comfort and tranquillity compels me to reveal a part of my history with which you are still unacquainted. Listen, and do not interrupt me. Should my confession disgust you, remember that in making it my sole aim is to satisfy your wishes and restore that peace to your heart which at present has abandoned it. I formerly mentioned that my guardian was a man of uncommon knowledge. He took pains to instill that knowledge into my infant mind. Among the various sciences which curiosity had induced him to explore, he neglected not that which by most is esteemed impious and by many chimerical. I speak of those arts which relate to the world of spirits. His deep researches into causes and effects, his unwearied application to the study of natural philosophy, his profound and unlimited knowledge of the properties and virtues of every gem which enriches the deep, of every herb which the earth produces, at length procured him the distinction which he had sought so long, so earnestly. His curiosity was fully slaked, his ambition amply gratified. He gave laws to the elements, he could reverse the order of nature, his eye read the mandates of futurity, and the infernal spirits were submissive to his commands. Why shrink you from me? I understand that inquiring look. Your suspicions are right, though your terrors are unfounded. My guardian concealed not from me his most precious acquisition. Yet, had I never seen you, I should never have exerted my power. Like you, I shuddered at the thoughts of magic. Like you, I had formed a terrible idea of the consequences of raising a demon. To preserve that life which your love had taught me to prize, I had recourse to means which I trembled at employing. You remember that night which I passed in St. Clare's sepulchre? Then was it that, surrounded by mouldering bodies, I dared to perform those mystic rites which summoned to my aid a fallen angel. Judge what must have been my joy at discovering that my terrors were imaginary. I saw the daemon obedient to my orders, I saw him trembling at my frown, and found that, instead of selling my soul to a master, my courage had purchased for myself a slave. Rash Matilda, what have you done? You have doomed yourself to endless perdition, you have bartered for momentary power eternal happiness. If on witchcraft depends the fruition of my desires, I renounce your aid most absolutely. The consequences are too horrible. I dote upon Antonia, but am not so blinded by lust as to sacrifice for her enjoyment my existence both in this world and the next. Ridiculous prejudices. Oh, blush, Ambrosio, blush at being subjected to their dominion. Where is the risk of accepting my offers? What should induce my persuading you to this step, except the wish of restoring you to happiness and quiet? If there is danger, it must fall upon me. It is I who invoke the ministry of the spirits, mine therefore will be the crime, and yours the profit. But danger there is none. The enemy of mankind is my slave, not my sovereign. Is there no difference between giving and receiving laws, between serving and commanding? Awake from your idle dreams, Ambrosio. Throw from you these terrors so ill-suited to a soul like yours, leave them for common men, and dare to be happy. Accompany me this night to St. Clare's sepulchre, witness my incantations, and Antonia is your own. To obtain her by such means I neither can or will. Cease then to persuade me, for I dare not employ hell's agency. You dare not? How have you deceived me? That mind which I esteem so great and valiant proves to be feeble, puerile, and grovelling, a slave to vulgar errors, and weaker than a woman's. What? Though conscious of the danger, wilfully shall I expose myself to the seducer's arts? Shall I renounce for ever my title to salvation? Shall my eyes seek a sight which I know will blast them? No, no, Matilda, I will not ally myself with God's enemy. Are you then God's friend at present? Have you not broken your engagements with him, renounced his service, and abandoned yourself to the impulse of your passions? Are you not planning the destruction of innocence, the ruin of a creature whom he formed in the mould of angels? If not of daemons, whose aid would you invoke to forward this laudable design? Will the seraphims protect it, conduct Antonia to your arms, and sanction with their ministry your illicit pleasures? Absurd. But I am not deceived, Ambrosio. It is not virtue which makes you reject my offer. You would accept it, but you dare not. 'Tis not the crime which holds your hand, but the punishment. 'Tis not respect for God which restrains you, but the terror of his vengeance. Fain would you offend him in secret, but you tremble to profess yourself his foe. Now shame on the coward soul, which wants the courage either to be a firm friend or open enemy. To look upon guilt with horror, Matilda, is in itself a merit. In this respect, I glory to confess myself a coward. Though my passions have made me deviate from her laws, I still feel in my heart an innate love of virtue. But it ill becomes you to tax me with my perjury, you who first seduced me to violate my vows, You, who first roused my sleeping vices, made me feel the weight of religion's chains, and bade me be convinced that guilt had pleasures. Yet though my principles have yielded to the force of temperament, I still have sufficient grace to shudder at sorcery, and avoid a crime so monstrous, so unpardonable. Unpardonable, say you? Where then is your constant boast of the Almighty's infinite mercy? Has he of late set bounds to it? Receives he no longer a sinner with joy? You injure him, Ambrosio. You will always have time to repent, and he have goodness to forgive. Afford him a glorious opportunity to exert that goodness. The greater your crime, the greater his merit in pardoning. Away then with these childish scruples, be persuaded to your good, and follow me to the sepulchre. Oh, cease, Matilda, that scoffing tone, that bold and impious language, is horrible in every mouth, but most so in a woman's. Let us drop a conversation which excites no other sentiments than horror and disgust. I will not follow you to the sepulchre, or accept the services of your infernal agents. Antonia shall be mine, but mine by human means. Then yours she will never be. You are banished her presence. Her mother has opened her eyes to your designs, and she is now upon her guard against them. Nay more, she loves another. A youth of distinguished merit possesses her heart, and unless you interfere, a few days will make her his bride. This intelligence was brought me by my invisible servants, to whom I had recourse on first perceiving your indifference. They watched your every action, related to me all that passed at Elvira's, and inspired me with the idea of favouring your designs. Their reports have been my only comfort. Though you shunned my presence, all your proceedings were known to me, nay, I was constantly with you in some degree, thanks to this precious gift. With these words she drew from beneath her habit a mirror of polished steel, the borders of which were marked with various strange and unknown characters. Amidst all my sorrows, amidst all my regrets for your coldness, I was sustained from despair by the virtues of this talisman. On pronouncing certain words, the person appears in it on whom the observer's thoughts are bent. Thus, though I was exiled from your sight, you, Ambrosio, were ever present to mine. The friar's curiosity was excited strongly. What you relate is incredible. Matilda, are you not amusing yourself with my credulity? Be your own eyes the judge. She put the mirror into his hand. Curiosity induced him to take it, and love, to wish that Antonia might appear. Matilda pronounced the magic words. Immediately a thick smoke rose from the characters traced upon the borders and spread itself over the surface. It dispersed again gradually. A confused mixture of colours and images presented themselves to the friar's eyes, which at length, arranging themselves in their proper places, he beheld in miniature Antonia's lovely form. The scene was a small closet belonging to her apartment. She was undressing to bathe herself. The long tresses of her hair were already bound up. The amorous monk had full opportunity to observe the voluptuous contours and admirable symmetry of her person. She threw off her last garment, and advancing to the bath prepared for her, she put her foot into the water. It struck cold, and she drew it back again. Though unconscious of being observed, an inbred sense of modesty induced her to veil her charms, and she stood hesitating upon the brink, in the attitude of the Venus de Medicis. At this moment a tame linnet flew towards her, nestled its head between her breasts, and nibbled them in wanton play. The smiling Antonia strove in vain to shake off the bird, and at length raised her hands to drive it from its delightful harbour. Ambrosio could bear no more. His desires were worked up to frenzy. I yield, he cried, dashing the mirror upon the ground. Matilda, I follow you. Do with me what you will. She waited not to hear his consent repeated. It was already midnight. She flew to her cell, and soon returned with her little basket and the key of the cemetery, which had remained in her possession since her first visit to the vaults. She gave the monk no time for reflection. Come, she said, and took his hand. Follow me, and witness the effects of your resolve. This said, she drew him hastily along. They passed into the burying ground unobserved, opened the door of the sepulchre, and found themselves at the head of the subterraneous staircase. As yet the beams of the full moon had guided their steps, but that resource now failed them. Matilda had neglected to provide herself with a lamp. Still holding Ambrosio's hand, she descended the marble steps, but the profound obscurity with which they were overspread obliged them to walk slow and cautiously. You tremble, said Matilda to her companion. Fear not, the destined spot is near. They reached the foot of the staircase and continued to proceed, feeling their way along the walls. On turning a corner suddenly, they descried faint gleams of light which seemed burning at a distance. Thither they bent their steps. The rays proceeded from a small sepulchral lamp which flamed unceasingly before the statue of St. Clare. It tinged with dim and cheerless beams the massy columns which supported the roof, but was too feeble to dissipate the thick gloom in which the vaults above were buried. Matilda took the lamp. "Wait for me," said she to the friar. "In a few moments I am here again." With these words she hastened into one of the passages which branched in various directions from this spot, and formed a sort of labyrinth. Ambrosio was now left alone. Darkness the most profound surrounded him, and encouraged the doubts which began to revive in his bosom. He had been hurried away by the delirium of the moment, the shame of betraying his terrors, while in Matilda's presence had induced him to repress them. But now that he was abandoned to himself, they resumed their former ascendancy. He trembled at the scene which he was soon to witness. He knew not how far the delusions of magic might operate upon his mind, and possibly might force him to some deed whose commission would make the breach between himself and heaven irreparable. In this fearful dilemma, he would have implored God's assistance, but was conscious that he had forfeited all claim to such protection. Gladly would he have returned to the abbey, but as he had passed through innumerable caverns and winding passages, the attempt of regaining the stairs was hopeless. His fate was determined, no possibility of escape presented itself. He therefore combated his apprehensions, and called every argument to his succour, which might enable him to support the trying scene with fortitude. He reflected that Antonia would be the reward of his daring. He inflamed his imagination by enumerating her charms. He persuaded himself that, as Matilda had observed, he always should have time sufficient for repentance, and that, as he employed her assistance, not that of the daemons, the crime of sorcery could not be laid to his charge. He had read much respecting witchcraft. He understood that unless a formal act was signed, renouncing his claim to salvation, Satan would have no power over him. He was fully determined not to execute any such act, whatever threats might be used, or advantages held out to him. Such were his meditations while waiting for Matilda. They were interrupted by a low murmur, which seemed at no great distance from him. He was startled. He listened. Some minutes passed in silence, after which the murmur was repeated. It appeared to be the groaning of one in pain. In any other situation, this circumstance would only have excited his attention and curiosity. In the present, his predominant sensation was that of terror. His imagination totally engrossed by the ideas of sorcery and spirits, he fancied that some unquiet ghost was wandering near him, or else that Matilda had fallen a victim to her presumption, and was perishing under the cruel fangs of the daemons. The noise seemed not to approach, but continued to be heard at intervals. Sometimes it became more audible, doubtless as the sufferings of the person who uttered the groans became more acute and insupportable. Ambrosio now and then thought that he could distinguish accents, and once in particular he was almost convinced that he heard a faint voice exclaim, "God! Oh God! No hope! No succour!" Yet deeper groans followed these words. They died away gradually, and universal silence again prevailed. "What can this mean?" thought the bewildered monk. At that moment an idea which flashed into his mind almost petrified him with horror. He started, and shuddered at himself. "Should it be possible?" he groaned involuntarily. "Should it but be possible? Oh, what a monster am I!" He wished to resolve his doubts, and to repair his fault, if it were not too late already. But these generous and compassionate sentiments were soon put to flight by the return of Matilda. He forgot the groaning sufferer, and remembered nothing but the danger and embarrassment of his own situation. The light of the returning lamp gilded the walls, and in a few moments after Matilda stood beside him. She had quitted her religious habit. She was now clothed in a long sable robe, on which was traced in gold embroidery a variety of unknown characters. It was fastened by a girdle of precious stones, in which was fixed a poignard. Her neck and arms were uncovered. In her hand she bore a golden wand. Her hair was loose and flowed wildly upon her shoulders. Her eyes sparkled with terrific expression, and her whole demeanour was calculated to inspire the beholder with awe and admiration. "Follow me," she said to the monk in a low and solemn voice. "All is ready." His limbs trembled while he obeyed her. She led him through various narrow passages, and on every side as they passed along, the beams of the lamp displayed none but the most revolting objects, skulls, bones, graves, and images, whose eyes seemed to glare on them with horror and surprise. At length they reached a spacious cavern, whose lofty roof the eye sought in vain to discover. A profound obscurity hovered through the void. Damp vapours struck cold to the friar's heart, and he listened sadly to the blast while it howled along the lonely vaults. Here Matilda stopped. She turned to Ambrosio. His cheeks and lips were pale with apprehension. By a glance of mingled scorn and anger she reproved his pusillanimity, but she spoke not. She placed the lamp upon the ground, near the basket. She motioned that Ambrosio should be silent, and began the mysterious rites. She drew a circle round him, another round herself, and then taking a small phial from the basket, poured a few drops upon the ground before her. She bent over the place, muttered some indistinct sentences, and immediately a pale sulphurous flame arose from the ground. It increased by degrees, and at length spread its waves over the whole surface, the circles alone excepted in which stood Matilda and the monk. It then ascended the huge columns of unhewn stone, glided along the roof, and formed the cavern into an immense chamber totally covered with blue, trembling fire. It emitted no heat, on the contrary. The extreme chillness of the place seemed to augment with every moment. Matilda continued her incantations. At intervals she took various articles from the basket, the nature and name of most of which were unknown to the friar. But among the few which he distinguished, he particularly observed 3 human fingers and an Agnus Dei which she broke in pieces. She threw them all into the flames which burned before her, and they were instantly consumed. The monk beheld her with anxious curiosity. Suddenly she uttered a loud and piercing shriek. She appeared to be seized with an access of delirium. She tore her hair, beat her bosom, used the most frantic gestures, and drawing the poignard from her girdle, plunged it into her left arm. The blood gushed out plentifully, and as she stood on the brink of the circle, she took care that it should fall on the outside. The flames retired from the spot on which the blood was pouring. A volume of dark clouds rose slowly from the ensanguined earth, and ascended gradually, till it reached the vault of the cavern. At the same time, a clap of thunder was heard. The echo pealed fearfully along the subterraneous passages, and the ground shook beneath the feet of the enchantress. It was now that Ambrosio repented of his rashness. The solemn singularity of the charm had prepared him for something strange and horrible. He waited with fear for the spirit's appearance, whose coming was announced by thunder and earthquakes. He looked wildly round him, expecting that some dreadful apparition would meet his eyes, the sight of which would drive him mad. A cold shivering seized his body, and he sank upon one knee, unable to support himself. "He comes!" exclaimed Matilda in a joyful accent. Ambrosio started, and expected the daemon with terror. What was his surprise, when the thunder ceasing to roll, a full strain of melodious music sounded in the air. At the same time the cloud dispersed, and he beheld a figure more beautiful than fancy's pencil ever drew. It was a youth seemingly scarce 18, the perfection of whose form and face was unrivalled. He was perfectly naked. A bright star sparkled upon his forehead, 2 crimson wings extended themselves from his shoulders, and his silken locks were confined by a band of many-coloured fires which played round his head, formed themselves into a variety of figures, and shone with a brilliance far surpassing that of precious stones. Circlets of diamonds were fastened round his arms and ankles, and in his right hand he bore a silver branch imitating myrtle. His form shone with dazzling glory. He was surrounded by clouds of rose-coloured light, and at the moment that he appeared, a refreshing air breathed perfumes through the cavern. Enchanted at a vision so contrary to his expectations, Ambrosio gazed upon the spirit with delight and wonder. Yet however beautiful the figure, he could not but remark a wildness in the daemon's eyes, and a mysterious melancholy impressed upon his features, betraying the fallen angel and inspiring the spectators with secret awe. The music ceased. Matilda addressed herself to the spirit. She spoke in a language unintelligible to the monk, and was answered in the same. She seemed to insist upon something which the daemon was unwilling to grant. He frequently darted upon Ambrosio angry glances, and at such times the friar's heart sank within him. Matilda appeared to grow incensed. She spoke in a loud and commanding tone, and her gestures declared that she was threatening him with her vengeance. Her menaces had the desired effect. The spirit sank upon his knee, and with a submissive air presented to her the branch of myrtle. No sooner had she received it, than the music was again heard. A thick cloud spread itself over the apparition. The blue flames disappeared, and total obscurity reigned through the cave. The abbot moved not from his place. His faculties were all bound up in pleasure, anxiety, and surprise. At length, the darkness dispersing, he perceived Matilda standing near him in her religious habit, with the myrtle in her hand. no traces of the incantation, and the vaults were only illuminated by the faint rays of the sepulchral lamp. "I have succeeded," said Matilda, "though with more difficulty than I expected. Lucifer, whom I summoned to my assistance, was at first unwilling to obey my commands. To enforce his compliance, I was constrained to have recourse to my strongest charms. They have produced the desired effect, but I have engaged never more to invoke his agency in your favour. Beware, then, how you employ an opportunity which never will return. My magic arts will now be of no use to you. In future, you can only hope for supernatural aid by invoking the daemons yourself and accepting the conditions of their service. This you will never do. You want strength of mind to force them to obedience, and unless you pay their established price, they will not be your voluntary servants. In this one instance they consent to obey you. I offer you the means of enjoying your mistress, and be careful not to lose the opportunity. Receive this constellated myrtle. While you bear this in your hand, every door will fly open to you. It will procure you access tomorrow night to Antonia's chamber. Then breathe upon it thrice, pronounce her name, and place it upon her pillow. A death-like slumber will immediately seize upon her and deprive her of the power of resisting your attempts. Sleep will hold her till break of morning. In this state you may satisfy your desires without danger of being discovered, since when daylight shall dispel the effects of the enchantment, Antonia will perceive her dishonour, but be ignorant of the ravisher. Be happy then, my Ambrosio, and let this service convince you that my friendship is disinterested and pure. The night must be near expiring. Let us return to the abbey, lest our absence should create surprise." The abbot received the talisman with silent gratitude. His ideas were too much bewildered by the adventures of the night to permit his expressing his thanks audibly, or indeed, as yet, to feel the whole value of her present. Matilda took up her lamp and basket, and guided her companion from the mysterious cavern. She restored the lamp to its former place, and continued her route in darkness till she reached the foot of the staircase. The first beams of the rising sun darting down it facilitated the ascent. Matilda and the abbot hastened out of the sepulchre, closed the door after them, and soon regained the abbey's western cloister. No one met them, and they retired unobserved to their respective cells. The confusion of Ambrosio's mind now began to appease. He rejoiced in the fortunate issue of his adventure, and reflecting upon the virtues of the myrtle, looked upon Antonia as already in his power. Imagination retraced to him those secret charms betrayed to him by the enchanted mirror, and he waited with impatience for the approach of midnight. Chapter 8. The crickets sing, and man's o'erlaboured sense repairs itself by rest. Our Tarquin thus did softly press the rushes, ere he wakened the chastity he wounded. Cytherea, how bravely thou becomest thy bed, fresh lily, and whiter than the sheets. Cymbeline. All the researches of the Marquis de las Cisternas proved vain. Agnes was lost to him for ever. Despair produced so violent an effect upon his constitution that the consequence was a long and severe illness. This prevented him from visiting Elvira as he had intended, and she being ignorant of the cause of his neglect, it gave her no trifling uneasiness. His sister's death had prevented Lorenzo from communicating to his uncle his designs respecting Antonia. The injunctions of her mother forbade his presenting himself to her without the Duke's consent, and as she heard no more of him or his proposals, Elvira conjectured that he had either met with a better match, or had been commanded to give up all thoughts of her daughter. Every day made her more uneasy respecting Antonia's fate, while she retained the abbot's protection. She bore with fortitude the disappointment of her hopes with regard to Lorenzo and the Marquis. That resource now failed her. She was convinced that Ambrosio had meditated her daughter's ruin, and when she reflected that her death would leave Antonia friendless and unprotected in a world so base, so perfidious and depraved, her heart swelled with the bitterness of apprehension. At such times she would sit for hours gazing upon the lovely girl, and seeming to listen to her innocent prattle, while in reality her thoughts dwelt upon the sorrows into which a moment would suffice to plunge her. Then she would clasp her in her arms suddenly, lean her head upon her daughter's bosom, and bedew it with her tears. An event was in preparation which, had she known it, would have relieved her from her inquietude. Lorenzo now waited only for a favourable opportunity to inform the Duke of his intended marriage. However, a circumstance which occurred at this period obliged him to delay his explanation for a few days longer. Don Raymond's malady seemed to gain ground. Lorenzo was constantly at his bedside, and treated him with a tenderness truly fraternal. Both the cause and effects of the disorder were highly afflicting to the brother of Agnes, yet Theodore's grief was scarcely less sincere. That amiable boy quitted not his master for a moment, and put every means in practice to console and alleviate his sufferings. The Marquis had conceived so rooted an affection for his deceased mistress that it was evident to all that he never could survive her loss. Nothing could have prevented him from sinking under his grief but the persuasion of her being still alive and in need of his assistance. Though convinced of its falsehood, his attendants encouraged him in a belief which formed his only comfort. He was assured daily that fresh perquisitions were making respecting the fate of Agnes. Stories were invented recounting the various attempts made to get admittance into the convent, and circumstances were related which, though they did not promise her absolute recovery, at least were sufficient to keep his hopes alive. The Marquis constantly fell into the most terrible excess of passion when informed of the failure of these supposed attempts. Still he would not credit that the succeeding ones would have the same fate, but flattered himself that the next would prove more fortunate. Theodore was the only one who exerted himself to realize his master's chimeras. He was eternally busied in planning schemes for entering the convent, or at least of obtaining from the nuns some intelligence of Agnes. To execute these schemes was the only inducement which could prevail on him to quit Don Raymond. He became a very Proteus, changing his shape every day, but all his metamorphoses were to very little purpose. He regularly returned to the Palace de las Cisternas without any intelligence to confirm his master's hopes. One day he took it into his head to disguise himself as a beggar. He put a patch over his left eye, took his guitar in hand, and posted himself at the gate of the convent. If Agnes is really confined in the convent, thought he, and hears my voice, she will recollect it, and possibly may find means to let me know that she is here. With this idea he mingled with a crowd of beggars who assembled daily at the gate of St. Clair to receive soup, which the nuns were accustomed to distribute at 12 o'clock. All were provided with jugs or bowls to carry it away. But as Theodore had no utensil of this kind, he begged leave to eat his portion at the convent door. This was granted without difficulty. His sweet voice, and in spite of his patched eye, his engaging countenance, won the heart of the good old portress, who, aided by a lay sister, was busied in serving to each his mess. Theodore was bade to stay till the others should depart, and promised that his request should then be granted. The youth desired no better, since it was not to eat soup that he presented himself at the convent. He thanked the portress for her permission, retired from the door, and seating himself upon a large stone, amused himself in tuning his guitar while the beggars were served. As soon as the crowd was gone, Theodore was beckoned to the gate, and desired to come in. He obeyed with infinite readiness, but affected great respect at passing the hallowed threshold, and to be much daunted by the presence of the reverend ladies. His feigned timidity flattered the vanity of the nuns, who endeavoured to reassure him. The portress took him into her own little parlour. In the meanwhile, the lay sister went to the kitchen, and soon returned with a double portion of soup, of better quality than what was given to the beggars. His hostess added some fruits and confections from her own private store, and both encouraged the youth to dine heartily. To all these attentions he replied with much seeming gratitude, and abundance of blessings upon his benefactresses. While he ate, the nuns admired the delicacy of his features, the beauty of his hair, and the sweetness and grace which accompanied all his actions. They lamented to each other in whispers that so charming a youth should be exposed to the seductions of the world, and agreed that he would be a worthy pillar of the Catholic Church. They concluded their conference by resolving that heaven would be rendered a real service if they entreated the prioress to intercede with Ambrosio for the beggar's admission into the order of Capuchins. This being determined, the portress, who was a person of great influence in the convent, posted away in all haste to the dominer's cell. Here she made so flaming a narrative of Theodore's merits that the old lady grew curious to see him. Accordingly, the portress was commissioned to convey him to the parlour grate. In the interim, the supposed beggar was sifting the lay sister with respect to the fate of Agnes. Her evidence only corroborated the dominer's assertions. She said that Agnes had been taken ill on returning from confession, had never quitted her bed from that moment, and that she had herself been present at the funeral. She even attested having seen her dead body and assisted with her own hands in adjusting it upon the bier. This account discouraged Theodore, yet as he had pushed the adventure so far, he resolved to witness its conclusion. The portress now returned and ordered him to follow her. He obeyed and was conducted into the parlour, where the lady prioress was already posted at the grate. The nuns surrounded her, who all flocked with eagerness to a scene which promised some diversion. Theodore saluted them with profound respect, and his presence had the power to smooth for a moment even the stern brow of the superior. She asked several questions respecting his parents, his religion, and what had reduced him to a state of beggary. To these demands his answers were perfectly satisfactory and perfectly false. He was then asked his opinion of a monastic life. He replied in terms of high estimation and respect for it. Upon this, the prioress told him that his obtaining an entrance into a religious order was not impossible, that her recommendation would not permit his poverty to be an obstacle, and that if she found him deserving it, he might depend in future upon her protection. Theodore assured her that to merit her favour would be his highest ambition, and having ordered him to return next day, when she would talk with him further, the domina quitted the parlour. The nuns, whom respect for the superior had till then kept silent, now crowded all together to the grate and assailed the youth with a multitude of questions. He had already examined each with attention. Alas, Agnes was not amongst them. The nuns heaped question upon question so thickly that it was scarcely possible for him to reply. One asked where he was born, since his accent declared him to be a foreigner. Another wanted to know why he wore a patch upon his left eye. Sister Helena inquired whether he had not a sister like him, because she should like such a companion, and Sister Rachel was fully persuaded that the brother would be the pleasanter companion of the two. Theodore amused himself with retailing to the credulous nuns for truths all the strange stories which his imagination could invent. He related to them his supposed adventures and penetrated every auditor with astonishment while he talked of giants, savages, shipwrecks and islands inhabited by anthropophagy and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders, with many other circumstances to the full as remarkable. He said that he was born in terra incognita, was educated at an Hottentot university, and had passed 2 years among the Americans of Silesia. "For what regards the loss of my eye," said he, "it was a just punishment upon me for disrespect to the Virgin when I made my second pilgrimage to Loreto. I stood near the altar in the miraculous chapel. The monks were proceeding to array the statue in her best apparel. The pilgrims were ordered to close their eyes during this ceremony, but though by nature extremely religious, curiosity was too powerful. At the moment, I shall penetrate you with horror, reverend ladies, when I reveal my crime. At the moment that the monks were changing her shift, I ventured to open my left eye and gave a little peep towards the statue. That look was my last. The glory which surrounded the Virgin was too great to be supported. I hastily shut my sacrilegious eye, and never have been able to unclose it since." At the relation of this miracle, the nuns all crossed themselves and promised to intercede with the Blessed Virgin for the recovery of his sight. They expressed their wonder at the extent of his travels and at the strange adventures which he had met with at so early an age. They now remarked his guitar and inquired whether he was an adept in music. He replied with modesty that it was not for him to decide upon his talents, but requested permission to appeal to them as judges. This was granted without difficulty. "But at least," said the old porteress, "take care not to sing anything profane." "You may depend upon my discretion," replied Theodore. "You shall hear how dangerous it is for young women to abandon themselves to their passions, illustrated by the adventure of a damsel who fell suddenly in love with an unknown knight." "But is the adventure true?" inquired the porteress. "Every word of it. It happened in Denmark, and the heroine was thought so beautiful that she was known by no other name but that of the lovely maid." "In Denmark, say you?" mumbled an old nun. "Are not the people all blacks in Denmark?" "By no means, reverend lady. They are of a delicate pea-green with flame-coloured hair and whiskers." "Mother of God!" "Pea-green?" exclaimed Sister Helena. "Oh, 'tis impossible, impossible," said the porteress with a look of contempt and exultation. "Not at all. When I was a young woman, I remember seeing several of them myself." Theodore now put his instrument in proper order. He had read the story of a king of England whose prison was discovered by a minstrel, and he hoped that the same scheme would enable him to discover Agnes, should she be in the convent. He chose a ballad which she had taught him herself in the castle of Lindenberg. She might possibly catch the sound, and he hoped to hear her replying to some of the stanzas. His guitar was now in tune, and he prepared to strike it. "But before I begin," said he, "it is necessary to inform you, ladies, that this same Denmark is terribly infested by sorcerers, witches, and evil spirits. Every element possesses its appropriate daemons. The woods are haunted by a malignant power called the Earl or Oak King. He it is who blights the trees, spoils the harvest, and commands the imps and goblins. He appears in the form of an old man of majestic figure, with a golden crown and long white beard. His principal amusement is to entice young children from their parents, and as soon as he gets them into his cave, he tears them into 1,000 pieces. The rivers are governed by another fiend, called the Water King. His province is to agitate the deep, occasion ship, wrecks, and drag the drowning sailors beneath the waves. He wears the appearance of a warrior, and employs himself in luring young virgins into his snare. What he does with them, when he catches them in the water, reverend ladies, I leave for you to imagine. The Fire King seems to be a man all formed of flames. He raises the meteors and wandering lights which beguile travellers into ponds and marshes, and he directs the lightning where it may do most mischief. The last of these elementary daemons is called the Cloud King. His figure is that of a beautiful youth, and he is distinguished by 2 large sable wings, though his outside is so enchanting. He is not a bit better disposed than the others. He is continually employed in raising storms, tearing up forests by the roots, and blowing castles and convents about the ears of their inhabitants. The first has a daughter, who is queen of the elves and fairies. The second has a mother, who is a powerful enchantress. Neither of these ladies are worth more than the gentleman. I do not remember to have heard any family assigned to the 2 other daemons, but at present I have no business with any of them except the fiend of the waters. He is the hero of my ballad, but I thought it necessary before I began to give you some account of his proceedings. Theodore then played a short symphony, after which, stretching his voice to its utmost extent to facilitate its reaching the ear of Agnes, he sang the following stanzas. Thai, nay, a Danish ballad. With gentle murmur flowed the tide, while by the fragrant flowery side the lovely maid with carols gay to Mary's church pursued her way. The water fiend's malignant eye along the banks beheld her high, straight to his mother, which he sped, and thus in suppliant accents said, "O mother, mother, now advise how I may yonder maid surprise. O mother, mother, now explain how I may yonder maid obtain." The which she gave him armour white, she formed him like a gallant knight, of water clear next made her hand a steed, whose housings were of sand. The Water King then swift, he went, to Mary's church his steps he bent. He bound his courser to the door, and paced the churchyard 3 times 4. His courser to the door bound he, and paced the churchyard full time 3, then hastened up the aisle, where all the people flocked, both great and small. The priest said, as the night drew near, "And wherefore comes the White Chief here?" The lovely maid she smiled aside, "Oh, would I were the White Chief's bride!" He stepped o'er benches 1 and 2. "Oh, lovely maid, I die for you!" He stepped o'er benches 2 and 3. "Oh, lovely maiden, go with me." Then sweet she smiled, the lovely maid, and while she gave her hand, she said, "Betide me joy, betide me woe, o'er hill, o'er dale, with thee I go." The priest their hands together joins, they dance, while clear the moon beam shines, and little thinks the maiden bright, her partner is the water sprite. "Oh, had some spirit deigned to sing, your partner is the Water King." The maid had fear and hate confessed, and cursed the hand which then she pressed, but nothing giving cause to think how near she strayed to danger's brink, still on she went, and hand in hand the lovers reached the yellow sand. "Ascend this steed with me, my dear, we needs must cross the streamlet here, ride boldly in, it is not deep, the winds are hushed, the billows sleep." Thus spoke the Water King. The maid her traitor, bridegroom's wish obeyed, and soon she saw the courser lave delighted in his parent wave. "Stop, stop, my love! The waters blue e'en now my shrinking foot bedew. Oh, lay aside your fears, sweetheart. We now have reached the deepest part. Stop, stop, my love, for now I see the waters rise above my knee. Oh, lay aside your fears, sweetheart. We now have reached the deepest part. Stop, stop, for God's sake, stop. For oh, the waters o'er my bosom flow." Scarce was the word pronounced, when knight and courser vanished from her sight. She shrieks, but shrieks in vain, for high the wild winds rising dull the cry, the fiend exults, the billows dash, and o'er their hapless victim wash. 3 times while struggling with the stream, the lovely maid was heard to scream. But when the tempest's rage was o'er, the lovely maid was seen no more. Warned by this tale, ye damsels fair, to whom you give your love beware. Believe not every handsome knight, and dance not with the water sprite." The youth ceased to sing. The nuns were delighted with the sweetness of his voice and masterly manner of touching the instrument. But however acceptable this applause would have been at any other time, at present it was insipid to Theodore. His artifice had not succeeded. He paused in vain between the stanzas, no voice replied to his, and he abandoned the hope of equalling Blondel. The convent bell now warned the nuns that it was time to assemble in the refectory. They were obliged to quit the grate. They thanked the youth for the entertainment which his music had afforded them, and charged him to return the next day. This he promised the nuns, to give him the greater inclination to keep his word, told him that he might always depend upon the convent for his meals, and each of them made him some little present. One gave him a box of sweetmeats, another an Agnus Dei, some brought relics of saints, waxen images and consecrated crosses, and others presented him with pieces of those works in which the religious excel, such as embroidery, artificial flowers, lace, and needlework. All these he was advised to sell, in order to put himself into better case, and he was assured that it would be easy to dispose of them, since the Spaniards hold the performances of the nuns in high estimation. Having received these gifts with seeming respect and gratitude, he remarked that, having no basket, he knew not how to convey them away. Several of the nuns were hastening in search of one, when they were stopped by the return of an elderly woman, whom Theodore had not till then observed. Her mild countenance and respectable air prejudiced him immediately in her favour. "Ha!" said the portress, "here comes the mother Saint Ursula with a basket." The nun approached the grate and presented the basket to Theodore. It was of willow, lined with blue satin, and upon the 4 sides were painted scenes from the legend of Saint Genevieve. "Here is my gift," said she, as she gave it into his hand. "Good youth, despise it not, though its value seems insignificant, it has many hidden virtues." She accompanied these words with an expressive look. It was not lost upon Theodore, in receiving the present, he drew as near the grate as possible. "Agnes," she whispered in a voice scarcely intelligible. Theodore, however, caught the sound. He concluded that some mystery was concealed in the basket, and his heart beat with impatience and joy. At this moment the domina returned. Her air was gloomy and frowning, and she looked, if possible, more stern than ever. "Mother Saint Ursula, I would speak with you in private." The nun changed colour, and was evidently disconcerted. "With me?" she replied in a faltering voice. The domina motioned that she must follow her, and retired. The mother Saint Ursula obeyed her. Soon after, the refectory bell ringing a second time, the nuns quitted the grate, and Theodore was left at liberty to carry off his prize. Delighted that at length he had obtained some intelligence for the Marquis, he flew rather than ran, till he reached the Hotel de las Cisternas. In a few minutes he stood by his master's bed with the basket in his hand. Lorenzo was in the chamber, endeavouring to reconcile his friend to a misfortune which he felt himself but too severely. Theodore related his adventure, and the hopes which had been created by the mother Saint Ursula's gift. The Marquis started from his pillow. That fire which since the death of Agnes had been extinguished, now revived in his bosom, and his eyes sparkled with the eagerness of expectation. The emotions which Lorenzo's countenance betrayed were scarcely weaker, and he waited with inexpressible impatience for the solution of this mystery. Raymond caught the basket from the hands of his page. He emptied the contents upon the bed, and examined them with minute attention. He hoped that a letter would be found at the bottom. Nothing of the kind appeared. The search was resumed, and still with no better success. At length, Don Raymond observed that one corner of the blue satin lining was unripped. He tore it open hastily, and drew forth a small scrap of paper, neither folded or sealed. It was addressed to the Marquis de las Cisternas, and the contents were as follows. "Having recognized your page, I venture to send these few lines. Procure an order from the Cardinal Duke for seizing my person, and that of the domina. But let it not be executed till Friday at midnight. It is the festival of Saint Clare. There will be a procession of nuns by torchlight, and I shall be among them. Beware not to let your intention be known. Should a syllable be dropped to excite the domina's suspicions, you will never hear of me more. Be cautious if you prize the memory of Agnes and wish to punish her assassins. I have that to tell, will freeze your blood with horror. St. Ursula." No sooner had the Marquis read the note than he fell back upon his pillow deprived of sense or motion. The hope failed him which till now had supported his existence, and these lines convinced him but too positively that Agnes was indeed no more. Lorenzo felt this circumstance less forcibly, since it had always been his idea that his sister had perished by unfair means. When he found by the mother-stained Ursula's letter how true were his suspicions, the confirmation excited no other sentiment in his bosom than a wish to punish the murderers as they deserved. It was no easy task to recall the Marquis to himself. As soon as he recovered his speech, he broke out into execrations against the assassins of his beloved and vowed to take upon them a signal vengeance. He continued to rave and torment himself with impotent passion, till his constitution, enfeebled by grief and illness, could support itself no longer, and he relapsed into insensibility. His melancholy situation sincerely affected Lorenzo, who would willingly have remained in the apartment of his friend, but other cares now demanded his presence. It was necessary to procure the order for seizing the prioress of St. Clair. For this purpose, having committed Raymond to the care of the best physicians in Madrid, he quitted the Hotel de las Cisternas and bent his course towards the palace of the Cardinal Duke. His disappointment was excessive when he found that affairs of state had obliged the cardinal to set out for a distant province. It wanted but 5 to Friday, yet by travelling day and night he hoped to return in time for the pilgrimage of St. Clair. In this he succeeded. He found the Cardinal Duke and represented to him the supposed culpability of the prioress, as also the violent effects which it had produced upon Don Raymond. He could have used no argument so forcible as this last. Of all his nephews, the Marquis was the only one to whom the Cardinal Duke was sincerely attached. He perfectly doted upon him, and the prioress could have committed no greater crime in his eyes than to have endangered the life of the Marquis. Consequently, he granted the order of arrest without difficulty. He also gave Lorenzo a letter to a principal officer of the Inquisition, desiring him to see his mandate executed. Furnished with these papers, Medina hastened back to Madrid, which he reached on the Friday a few hours before dark. He found the Marquis somewhat easier, but so weak and exhausted that without great exertion he could neither speak or more. Having passed an hour by his bedside, Lorenzo left him to communicate his design to his uncle, as also to give Don Ramirez de Mello the cardinal's letter. The first was petrified with horror when he learnt the fate of his unhappy niece. He encouraged Lorenzo to punish her assassins, and engaged to accompany him at night to St. Clair's convent. Don Ramirez promised his firmest support, and selected a band of trusty archers to prevent opposition on the part of the populace. But while Lorenzo was anxious to unmask one religious hypocrite, he was unconscious of the sorrows prepared for him by another. Aided by Matilda's infernal agents, Ambrosio had resolved upon the innocent Antonia's ruin. The moment destined to be so fatal to her arrived. She had taken leave of her mother for the night. As she kissed her, she felt an unusual despondency infuse itself into her bosom. She left her, and returned to her instantly, threw herself into her maternal arms, and bathed her cheek with tears. She felt uneasy at quitting her, and a secret presentiment assured her that never must they meet again. Elvira observed, and tried to laugh her out of this childish prejudice. She chid her mildly for encouraging such ungrounded sadness, and warned her how dangerous it was to encourage such ideas. To all her remonstrances she received no other answer than, "Mother, dear mother, oh, would to God it were morning!" Elvira, whose inquietude respecting her daughter was a great obstacle to her perfect re-establishment, was still labouring under the effects of her late severe illness. She was this evening more than usually indisposed, and retired to bed before her accustomed hour. Antonia withdrew from her mother's chamber with regret, and till the door closed, kept her eyes fixed upon her with melancholy expression. She retired to her own apartment. Her heart was filled with bitterness. It seemed to her that all her prospects were blasted, and the world contained nothing for which it was worth existing. She sank into a chair, reclined her head upon her arm, and gazed upon the floor with a vacant stare, while the most gloomy images floated before her fancy. She was still in this state of insensibility when she was disturbed by hearing a strain of soft music breathed beneath her window. She rose, drew near the casement, and opened it to hear it more distinctly. Having thrown her veil over her face, she ventured to look out. By the light of the moon she perceived several men below with guitars and lutes in their hands, and at a little distance from them stood another wrapped in his cloak, whose stature and appearance bore a strong resemblance to Lorenzo's. She was not deceived in this conjecture. It was indeed Lorenzo himself, who, bound by his word not to present himself to Antonia without his uncle's consent, endeavoured by occasional serenades to convince his mistress that his attachment still existed. His stratagem had not the desired effect. Antonia was far from supposing that this nightly music was intended as a compliment to her. She was too modest to think herself worthy such attentions, and concluding them to be addressed to some neighbouring lady, she grieved to find that they were offered by Lorenzo. The air which was played was plaintive and melodious. It accorded with the state of Antonia's mind, and she listened with pleasure. After a symphony of some length, it was succeeded by the sound of voices, and Antonia distinguished the following words. Serenade Chorus. Oh, breathe in gentle strain, my lyre. 'Tis here that beauty loves to rest, describe the pangs of fond desire, which rend a faithful lover's breast. Song in every heart to find a slave, in every soul to fix his reign, in bonds to lead the wise and brave, and make the captives kiss his chain. Such is the power of love, and oh, I grieve so well love's power to know, in sighs to pass the livelong day, to taste a short and broken sleep, for one dear object far away, all others scorned, to watch and weep. Such are the pains of love, and oh, I grieve so well love's pains to know. To read consent in virgin eyes, to press the lip near pressed till then, to hear the sigh of transport rise, and kiss and kiss and kiss again, such are thy pleasures, love, but oh, when shall my heart thy pleasures know? Chorus, now hush, my lyre, my voice be still, sleep, gentle maid. May fond desire with amorous thoughts thy visions fill, though still my voice, and hushed my lyre. The music ceased, the performers dispersed, and silence prevailed through the street. Antonia quitted the window with regret. She as usual recommended herself to the protection of Saint Trozosia, said her accustomed prayers, and retired to bed. Sleep was not long absent, and his presence relieved her from her terrors and inquietude. It was almost 2 o'clock before the lustful monk ventured to bend his steps towards Antonia's dwelling. It has been already mentioned that the abbey was at no great distance from the Strada di San Iago. He reached the house unobserved. Here he stopped and hesitated for a moment. He reflected on the enormity of the crime, the consequences of a discovery, and the probability, after what had passed, of Elvira suspecting him to be her daughter's ravisher. On the other hand, it was suggested that she could do no more than suspect, that no proofs of his guilt could be produced, that it would seem impossible for the rape to have been committed without Antonia's knowing when, where, or by whom, and finally, he believed that his fame was too firmly established to be shaken by the unsupported accusations of 2 unknown women. This latter argument was perfectly false. He knew not how uncertain is the air of popular applause, and that a moment suffices to make him today the detestation of the world, who yesterday was its idol. The result of the monk's deliberations was that he should proceed in his enterprise. He ascended the steps leading to the house. No sooner did he touch the door with the silver myrtle than it flew open and presented him with a free passage. He entered, and the door closed after him of its own accord. Guided by the moonbeams, he proceeded up the staircase with slow and cautious steps. He looked round him every moment with apprehension and anxiety. He saw a spy in every shadow, and heard a voice in every murmur of the night breeze. Consciousness of the guilty business on which he was employed appalled his heart, and rendered it more timid than a woman's. Yet still he proceeded. He reached the door of Antonia's chamber. He stopped and listened. All was hushed within. The total silence persuaded him that his intended victim was retired to rest, and he ventured to lift up the latch. The door was fastened and resisted his efforts, but no sooner was it touched by the talisman than the bolt flew back. The ravisher stepped on and found himself in the chamber where slept the innocent girl, unconscious how dangerous a visitor was drawing near her couch. The door closed after him, and the bolt shot again into its fastening. Ambrosio advanced with precaution. He took care that not a board should creak under his foot, and held in his breath as he approached the bed. His first attention was to perform the magic ceremony. As Matilda had charged him, he breathed thrice upon the silver myrtle, pronounced over it Antonia's name, and laid it upon her pillow. The effects which it had already produced permitted not his doubting its success in prolonging the slumbers of his devoted mistress. No sooner was the enchantment performed than he considered her to be absolutely in his power, and his eyes flamed with lust and impatience. He now ventured to cast a glance upon the sleeping beauty. A single lamp, burning before the statue of Stantrazolia, shed a faint light through the room, and permitted him to examine all the charms of the lovely object before him. The heat of the weather had obliged her to throw off part of the bed. Clothes, those which still covered her, Ambrosio's insolent hand hastened to remove. She lay with her cheek reclining upon one ivory arm, The other rested on the side of the bed with graceful indolence. A few tresses of her hair had escaped from beneath the muslin which confined the rest and fell carelessly over her bosom as it heaved with slow and regular suspiration. The warm air had spread her cheek with higher colour than usual. A smile inexpressibly sweet played round her ripe and coral lips, from which every now and then escaped a gentle sigh or an half-pronounced sentence. An air of enchanting innocence and candour pervaded her whole form, and there was a sort of modesty in her very nakedness, which added fresh stings to the desires of the lustful monk. He remained for some moments devouring those charms with his eyes, which soon were to be subjected to his ill-regulated passions. Her mouth half-opened seemed to solicit a kiss. He bent over her. He joined his lips to hers and drew in the fragrance of her breath with rapture. This momentary pleasure increased his longing for still greater. His desires were raised to that frantic height by which brutes are agitated. He resolved not to delay for one instant longer the accomplishment of his wishes, and hastily proceeded to tear off those garments which impeded the gratification of his lust. "Gracious God!" exclaimed a voice behind him. "Am I not deceived? Is not this an illusion?" Terror, confusion, and disappointment accompanied these words as they struck Ambrosio's hearing. He started and turned towards it. Elvira stood at the door of the chamber and regarded the monk with looks of surprise and detestation. A frightful dream had represented to her Antonia on the verge of a precipice. She saw her trembling on the brink, every moment seemed to threaten her fall, and she heard her exclaim with shrieks, "Save me, mother, save me! Yet a moment, and it will be too late." Elvira woke in terror. The vision had made too strong an impression upon her mind to permit her resting till assured of her daughter's safety. She hastily started from her bed, threw on a loose nightgown, and passing through the closet in which slept the waiting woman, she reached Antonia's chamber just in time to rescue her from the grasp of the ravisher. His shame and her amazement seemed to have petrified into statues both Elvira and the monk. They remained gazing upon each other in silence. The lady was the first to recover herself. "It is no dream," she cried. "It is really Ambrosio who stands before me. It is the man whom Madrid esteems a saint that I find at this late hour near the couch of my unhappy child. Monster of hypocrisy! I already suspected your designs, but forbore your accusation in pity to human frailty. Silence would now be criminal. The whole city shall be informed of your incontinence. I will unmask you, villain, and convince the church what a viper she cherishes in her bosom." Pale and confused, the baffled culprit stood trembling before her. He would fain have extenuated his offence, but could find no apology for his conduct. He could produce nothing but broken sentences and excuses which contradicted each other. Elvira was too justly incensed to grant the pardon which he requested. She protested that she would raise the neighbourhood and make him an example to all future hypocrites. Then hastening to the bed, she called to Antonia to wake, and finding that her voice had no effect, she took her arm and raised her forcibly from the pillow. The charm operated too powerfully. Antonia remained insensible, and on being released by her mother, sank back upon the pillow. "This slumber cannot be natural," cried the amazed Elvira, whose indignation increased with every moment. "Some mystery is concealed in it, but tremble, hypocrite, all your villainy shall soon be unravelled. Help! Help!" she exclaimed aloud. "Within there!" "Flora, Flora, Flora. Hear me for one moment, lady," cried the monk, restored to himself by the urgency of the danger. "By all that is sacred and holy, I swear that your daughter's honour is still unviolated. Forgive my transgression. Spare me the shame of a discovery, and permit me to regain the abbey undisturbed. Grant me this request in mercy." "I promise not only that Antonia shall be secure from me in future, but that the rest of my life shall prove," Elvira interrupted him abruptly. "Antonia secure from you? I will secure her. You shall betray no longer the confidence of parents. Your iniquity shall be unveiled to the public eye. All Madrid shall shudder at your perfidy, your hypocrisy and incontinence. What ho there, Flora, Flora, I say?" While she spoke thus, the remembrance of Agnes struck upon his mind. Thus had she sued to him for mercy, and thus had he refused her prayer. It was now his turn to suffer, and he could not but acknowledge that his punishment was just. In the meanwhile, Elvira continued to call Flora to her assistance, but her voice was so choked with passion that the servant, who was buried in profound slumber, was insensible to all her cries. Elvira dared not go towards the closet in which Flora slept, lest the monk should take that opportunity to escape. Such indeed was his intention. He trusted that could he reach the abbey unobserved by any other than Elvira, her single testimony would not suffice to ruin a reputation so well established as his was in Madrid. With this idea he gathered up such garments as he had already thrown off and hastened towards the door. Elvira was aware of his design. She followed him, and ere he could draw back the bolt, seized him by the arm and detained him. "Attempt not to fly," said she. "You quit not this room without witnesses of your guilt." Ambrosio struggled in vain to disengage himself. Elvira quitted not her hold, but redoubled her cries for succour. The friar's danger grew more urgent. He expected every moment to hear people assembling at her voice, and worked up to madness by the approach of ruin, he adopted a resolution equally desperate and savage. Turning round suddenly, with one hand he grasped Elvira's throat so as to prevent her continuing her clamour, and with the other, dashing her violently upon the ground, he dragged her towards the bed. Confused by this unexpected attack, she scarcely had power to strive at forcing herself from his grasp, while the monk, snatching the pillow from beneath her daughter's head, covering with it Elvira's face, and pressing his knee upon her stomach with all his strength, endeavoured to put an end to her existence. He succeeded but too well. Her natural strength increased by the excess of anguish. Long did the sufferer struggle to disengage herself, but in vain. The monk continued to kneel upon her breast, witnessed without mercy the convulsive trembling of her limbs beneath him, and sustained with inhuman firmness the spectacle of her agonies, when soul and body were on the point of separating. Those agonies at length were over. She ceased to struggle for life. The monk took off the pillow and gazed upon her. Her face was covered with a frightful blackness, her limbs moved no more, the blood was chilled in her veins, her heart had forgotten to beat, and her hands were stiff and frozen. Ambrosio beheld before him that once noble and majestic form, now become a coarse, cold, senseless, and disgusting. This horrible act was no sooner perpetrated than the friar beheld the enormity of his crime. A cold dew flowed over his limbs, his eyes closed, he staggered to a chair and sank into it almost as lifeless as the unfortunate who lay extended at his feet. From this state he was roused by the necessity of flight, and the danger of being found in Antonia's apartment. He had no desire to profit by the execution of his crime. Antonia now appeared to him an object of disgust. A deadly cold had usurped the place of that warmth which glowed in his bosom. No ideas offered themselves to his mind, but those of death and guilt, of present shame and future punishment. Agitated by remorse and fear he prepared for flight, yet his terrors did not so completely master his recollection as to prevent his taking the precautions necessary for his safety. He replaced the pillow upon the bed, gathered up his garments, and with the fatal talisman in his hand, bent his unsteady steps towards the door. Bewildered by fear, he fancied that his flight was opposed by legions of phantoms. Wherever he turned, the disfigured corse seemed to lie in his passage, and it was long before he succeeded in reaching the door. The enchanted myrtle produced its former effect. The door opened, and he hastened down the staircase. He entered the abbey unobserved, and having shut himself into his cell, he abandoned his soul to the tortures of unavailing remorse and terrors of impending detection. Chapter 9. Tell us, ye dead, will none of you in pity to those you left behind disclose the secret? Oh, that some courteous ghost would blab it out, what 'tis you are, and we must shortly be. I've heard that souls departed have sometimes forewarned men of their deaths. 'Twas kindly done to knock and give the alarum. Blair. Ambrosio shuddered at himself when he reflected on his rapid advances in iniquity. The enormous crime which he had just committed filled him with real horror. The murdered Elvira was continually before his eyes, and his guilt was already punished by the agonies of his conscience. Time, however, considerably weakened these impressions. One day passed away, another followed it, and still not the least suspicion was thrown upon him. Impunity reconciled him to his guilt. He began to resume his spirits, and as his fears of detection died away, he paid less attention to the reproaches of remorse. Matilda exerted herself to quiet his alarms. At the first intelligence of Elvira's death, she seemed greatly affected, and joined the monk in deploring the unhappy catastrophe of his adventure. But when she found his agitation to be somewhat calmed, and himself better disposed to listen to her arguments, she proceeded to mention his offence in milder terms, and convince him that he was not so highly culpable as he appeared to consider himself. She represented that he had only availed himself of the rights which nature allows to everyone, those of self-preservation. that either Elvira or himself must have perished, and that her inflexibility and resolution to ruin him had deservedly marked her out for the victim. She next stated that as he had before rendered himself suspected to Elvira, it was a fortunate event for him that her lips were closed by death, since without this last adventure, her suspicions, if made public, might have produced very disagreeable consequences. He had therefore freed himself from an enemy, to whom the errors of his conduct were sufficiently known to make her dangerous, and who was the greatest obstacle to his designs upon Antonia. Those designs she encouraged him not to abandon. She assured him that, no longer protected by her mother's watchful eye, the daughter would fall an easy conquest, and by praising and enumerating Antonia's charms, she strove to rekindle the desires of the monk. In this endeavour she succeeded but too well. As if the crimes into which his passion had seduced him had only increased its violence, he longed more eagerly than ever to enjoy Antonia. The same success in concealing his present guilt he trusted would attend his future. He was deaf to the murmurs of conscience, and resolved to satisfy his desires at any price. He waited only for an opportunity of repeating his former enterprise, but to procure that opportunity by the same means was now impracticable. In the first transports of despair he had dashed the enchanted myrtle into 1,000 pieces. Matilda told him plainly that he must expect no further assistance from the infernal powers unless he was willing to subscribe to their established conditions. This Ambrosio was determined not to do. He persuaded himself that however great might be his iniquity, so long as he preserved his claim to salvation, he need not despair of pardon. He therefore resolutely refused to enter into any bond or compact with the fiends, and Matilda, finding him obstinate upon this point, forbore to press him further. She exerted her invention to discover some means of putting Antonia into the abbot's power, nor was it long before that means presented itself. While her ruin was thus meditating, the unhappy girl herself suffered severely from the loss of her mother. Every morning on waking, it was her first care to hasten to Elvira's chamber. On that which followed Ambrosio's fatal visit, she woke later than was her usual custom. Of this she was convinced by the abbey chimes. She started from her bed, threw on a few loose garments hastily, and was speeding to inquire how her mother had passed the night, when her foot struck against something which lay in her passage. She looked down. What was her horror at recognizing Elvira's livid corse! She uttered a loud shriek and threw herself upon the floor. She clasped the inanimate form to her bosom, felt that it was dead cold, and with a movement of disgust, of which she was not the mistress, let it fall again from her arms. The cry had alarmed Flora, who hastened to her assistance. The sight which she beheld penetrated her with horror, but her alarm was more audible than Antonia's. She made the house ring with her lamentations, while her mistress, almost suffocated with grief, could only mark her distress by sobs and groans. Flora's shrieks soon reached the ears of the hostess, whose terror and surprise were excessive on learning the cause of this disturbance. A physician was immediately sent for, but on the first moment of beholding the corse, he declared that Elvira's recovery was beyond the power of art. He proceeded therefore to give his assistance to Antonia, who by this time was truly in need of it. She was conveyed to bed, while the landlady busied herself in giving orders for Elvira's burial. Dame Jacintha was a plain good kind of woman, charitable, generous, and devout, but her intellects were weak, and she was a miserable slave to fear and superstition. She shuddered at the idea of passing the night in the same house with a dead body. She was persuaded that Elvira's ghost would appear to her, and no less certain that such a visit would kill her with fright. From this persuasion, she resolved to pass the night at a neighbour's, and insisted that the funeral should take place the next day. Stainclair's cemetery being the nearest, it was determined that Elvira should be buried there. Dame Jacintha engaged to defray every expense attending the burial. She knew not in what circumstances Antonia was left, but from the sparing manner in which the family had lived, she concluded them to be indifferent. Consequently, she entertained very little hope of ever being recompensed, but this consideration prevented her not from taking care that the interment was performed with decency, and from showing the unfortunate Antonia all possible respect. Nobody dies of mere grief. Of this Antonia was an instance. Aided by her youth and healthy constitution, she shook off the malady which her mother's death had occasioned, but it was not so easy to remove the disease of her mind. Her eyes were constantly filled with tears, every trifle affected her, and she evidently nourished in her bosom a profound and rooted melancholy. The slightest mention of Elvira, The most trivial circumstance recalling that beloved parent to her memory was sufficient to throw her into serious agitation. How much would her grief have been increased had she known the agonies which terminated her mother's existence? But of this no one entertained the least suspicion. Elvira was subject to strong convulsions. It was supposed that, aware of their approach, she had dragged herself to her daughter's chamber in hopes of assistance, that a sudden access of her fits had seized her, too violent to be resisted by her already enfeebled state of health, and that she had expired ere she had time to reach the medicine which generally relieved her and which stood upon a shelf in Antonia's room. This idea was firmly credited by the few people who interested themselves about Elvira. Her death was esteemed a natural event, and soon forgotten by all save by her, who had but too much reason to deplore her loss. In truth, Antonia's situation was sufficiently embarrassing and unpleasant. She was alone in the midst of a dissipated and expensive city. She was ill provided with money, and worse with friends. Her aunt Leonela was still at Cordova, and she knew not her direction. Of the Marquis de las Cisternas she heard no news. As to Lorenzo, she had long given up the idea of possessing any interest in his bosom. She knew not to whom she could address herself in her present dilemma. She wished to consult Ambrosio, but she remembered her mother's injunctions to shun him as much as possible, and the last conversation which Elvira had held with her upon the subject had given her sufficient lights respecting his designs to put her upon her guard against him in future. Still, all her mother's warnings could not make her change her good opinion of the friar. She continued to feel that his friendship and society were requisite to her happiness. She looked upon his failings with a partial eye, and could not persuade herself that he really had intended her ruin. However, Elvira had positively commanded her to drop his acquaintance, and she had too much respect for her orders to disobey them. At length she resolved to address herself for advice and protection to the Marquis de las Cisternas, as being her nearest relation. She wrote to him, briefly stating her desolate situation. She besought him to compassionate his brother's child, to continue to her Elvira's pension, and to authorize her retiring to his old castle in Murcia, which till now had been her retreat. Having sealed her letter, she gave it to the trusty Flora, who immediately set out to execute her commission. But Antonia was born under an unlucky star. Had she made her application to the Marquis, but one day sooner, received as his niece, and placed at the head of his family, she would have escaped all the misfortunes with which she was now threatened. Raymond had always intended to execute this plan, but first, his hopes of making the proposal to Elvira through the lips of Agnes, and afterwards his disappointment at losing his intended bride, as well as the severe illness which for some time had confined him to his bed, made him defer from day to day the giving an asylum in his house to his brother's widow. He had commissioned Lorenzo to supply her liberally with money, but Elvira, unwilling to receive obligations from that nobleman, had assured him that she needed no immediate pecuniary assistance. Consequently, the Marquis did not imagine that a trifling delay on his part could create any embarrassment, and the distress and agitation of his mind might well excuse his negligence. Had he been informed that Elvira's death had left her daughter friendless and unprotected, he would doubtless have taken such measures as would have ensured her from every danger, but Antonia was not destined to be so fortunate. The day on which she sent her letter to the Palace de las Cisternas was that following Lorenzo's departure from Madrid. The Marquis was in the first paroxysms of despair at the conviction that Agnes was indeed no more. He was delirious, and his life being in danger, no one was suffered to approach him. Flora was informed that he was incapable of attending to letters, and that probably a few hours would decide his fate. With this unsatisfactory answer, she was obliged to return to her mistress, who now found herself plunged into greater difficulties than ever. Flora and Dame Jacinta exerted themselves to console her. The latter begged her to make herself easy, for that, as long as she chose to stay with her, she would treat her like her own child. Antonia, finding that the good woman had taken a real affection for her, was somewhat comforted by thinking that she had at least one friend in the world. A letter was now brought to her, directed to Elvira. She recognized Leonella's writing, and opening it with joy, found a detailed account of her aunt's adventures at Cordova. She informed her sister that she had recovered her legacy, had lost her heart, and had received in exchange that of the most amiable of apothecaries, past, present, and to come. She added that she should be at Madrid on the Tuesday night, and meant to have the pleasure of presenting her caro sposo in form. Though her nuptials were far from pleasing Antonia, Leonella's speedy return gave her niece much delight. She rejoiced in thinking that she should once more be under a relation's care. She could not but judge it to be highly improper, For a young woman to be living among absolute strangers, with no one to regulate her conduct or protect her from the insults to which, in her defenceless situation, she was exposed. She therefore looked forward with impatience to the Tuesday night. It arrived. Antonia listened anxiously to the carriages as they rolled along the street. None of them stopped, and it grew late without Linella's appearing. Still, Antonia resolved to sit up till her aunt's arrival, and in spite of all her remonstrances, Dame Jacintha and Flora insisted upon doing the same. The hours passed on slow and tediously. Lorenzo's departure from Madrid had put a stop to the nightly serenades. She hoped in vain to hear the usual sound of guitars beneath her window. She took up her own and struck a few chords, but music that evening had lost its charms for her, and she soon replaced the instrument in its case. She seated herself at her embroidery frame, but nothing went right. The silks were missing, the thread snapped every moment, and the needles were so expert at falling that they seemed to be animated. At length a flake of wax fell from the taper which stood near her upon a favourite wreath of violets. This completely discomposed her. She threw down her needle and quitted the frame. It was decreed that for that night nothing should have the power of amusing her. She was the prey of ennui, and employed herself in making fruitless wishes for the arrival of her aunt. As she walked with a listless air up and down the chamber, the door caught her eye, conducting to that which had been her mother's. She remembered that Elvira's little library was arranged there, and thought that she might possibly find in it some book to amuse her till Linella should arrive. Accordingly, she took her taper from the table, passed through the little closet, and entered the adjoining apartment. As she looked around her, the sight of this room brought to her recollection 1,000 painful ideas. It was the first time of her entering it since her mother's death. The total silence prevailing through the chamber, the bed despoiled of its furniture, the cheerless hearth where stood an extinguished lamp, and a few dying plants in the window which, since Elvira's loss, had been neglected, inspired Antonia with a melancholy awe. The gloom of night gave strength to this sensation. She placed her light upon the table, and sank into a large chair, in which she had seen her mother seated 1,000 times. She was never to see her seated there again. Tears unbidden streamed down her cheek, and she abandoned herself to the sadness which grew deeper with every moment. Ashamed of her weakness, she at length rose from her seat. She proceeded to seek for what had brought her to this melancholy scene. The small collection of books was arranged upon several shelves in order. Antonia examined them without finding anything likely to interest her, till she put her hand upon a volume of old Spanish ballads. She read a few stanzas of one of them. They excited her curiosity. She took down the book and seated herself to peruse it with more ease. She trimmed the taper, which now drew towards its end, and then read the following ballad. Alonso the brave, and fair Imogen, a warrior so bold, and a virgin so bright conversed, as they sat on the green, they gazed on each other with tender delight. Alonso the brave was the name of the knight, the maid's was the fair Imogen. And oh, said the youth, since tomorrow I go to fight in a far distant land, your tears for my absence soon leaving to flow, some other will court you, and you will bestow on a wealthier suitor your hand. Oh, hush these suspicions, fair Imogen said, offensive to love and to me. For if ye be living, or if ye be dead, I swear by the Virgin, that none in your stead shall husband of Imogen be. If ere I by lust or by wealth led aside, forget my Alonso the brave, God grant, that to punish my falsehood and pride your ghost at the marriage may sit by my side, may tax me with perjury, claim me as bride, and bear me away to the grave. To Palestine hastened the hero so bold, his love, she lamented him sore, but scarce had a 12-month elapsed, when behold, a baron, all covered with jewels and gold, arrived at fair Imogen's door. His treasure, his presence, his spacious domain, soon made her untrue to her vows. He dazzled her eyes, he bewildered her brain, he caught her affections so light and so vain, and carried her home as his spouse. And now had the marriage been blessed by the priest, the revelry now was begun, the tables. They groaned with the weight of the feast, nor yet had the laughter and merriment ceased, when the bell of the castle tolled 1. Then first, with amazement, fair Imogen found that a stranger was placed by her side. His air was terrific. He uttered no sound, he spoke not, he moved not, he looked not around, but earnestly gazed on the bride. His visor was closed, and gigantic his height, his armour was sable to view. All pleasure and laughter were hushed at his sight. The dogs, as they eyed him, drew back in affright. The lights in the chamber burned blue. His presence all bosoms appeared to dismay, the guests sat in silence and fear. At length spoke the bride, while she trembled. "I pray, Sir Knight, that your helmet aside you would lay, and deign to partake of our cheer." The lady is silent, the stranger complies. His visor lies slowly unclosed. Oh, God! What a sight met fair Imogen's eyes! What words can express her dismay and surprise when a skeleton's head was exposed? All present then uttered a terrified shout, all turned with disgust from the scene. The worms they crept in, and the worms they crept out, and sported his eyes and his temples about, while the spectre addressed Imogen. "Behold me, thou false one." "Behold me," he cried, "remember Alonso the brave. God grants that to punish thy falsehood and pride my ghost at thy marriage should sit by thy side, should tax thee with perjury, claim thee as bride, and bear thee away to the grave." Thus saying, his arms round the lady he wound, while loudly she shrieked in dismay, then sank with his prey through the wide yawning ground, nor ever again was fair Imogen found, or the spectre who bore her away. Not long lived the Baron, and none since that time to inhabit the castle presume, for chronicles tell, that by order sublime their Imogen suffers the pain of her crime, and mourns her deplorable doom. At midnight 4 times in each year does her sprite, when mortals in slumber abound, arrayed in her bridal apparel of white, appear in the hall with the skeleton knight, and shriek, as he whirls her around. While they drink out of skulls newly torn from the grave, dancing round them the spectres are seen, their liquor is blood, and this horrible stave they howl. To the health of Alonso the brave, and his consort, the false Imogen. The perusal of this story was ill calculated to dispel Antonia's melancholy. She had naturally a strong inclination to the marvellous, and her nurse, who believed firmly in apparitions, had related to her when an infant so many horrible adventures of this kind that all Elvira's attempts had failed to eradicate their impressions from her daughter's mind. Antonia still nourished a superstitious prejudice in her bosom. She was often susceptible of terrors which, when she discovered their natural and insignificant cause, made her blush at her own weakness. With such a turn of mind, the adventure which she had just been reading sufficed to give her apprehensions the alarm. The hour and the scene combined to authorize them. It was the dead of night, she was alone, and in the chamber once occupied by her deceased mother. The weather was comfortless and stormy, the wind howled around the house, the doors rattled in their frames, and the heavy rain pattered against the windows. No other sound was heard. The taper, now burnt down to the socket, sometimes flaring upwards, shot a gleam of light through the room, then sinking again seemed upon the point of expiring. Antonia's heart throbbed with agitation, her eyes wandered fearfully over the objects around her as the trembling flame illuminated them at intervals. She attempted to rise from her seat, but her limbs trembled so violently that she was unable to proceed. She then called Flora, who was in a room at no great distance, but agitation choked her voice, and her cries died away in hollow murmurs. She passed some minutes in this situation, after which her terrors began to diminish. She strove to recover herself and acquire strength enough to quit the room. Suddenly she fancied that she heard a low sigh drawn near her. This idea brought back her former weakness. She had already raised herself from her seat and was on the point of taking the lamp from the table. The imaginary noise stopped her. She drew back her hand and supported herself upon the back of a chair. She listened anxiously, but nothing more was heard. "Gracious God," she said to herself, "what could be that sound? Was I deceived, or did I really hear it?" Her reflections were interrupted by a noise at the door, scarcely audible. It seemed as if somebody was whispering. Antonia's alarm increased, yet the bolt she knew to be fastened, and this idea in some degree reassured her. Presently the latch was lifted up softly, and the door moved with caution backwards and forwards. Excess of terror now supplied Antonia with that strength, of which she had till then been deprived. She started from her place and made towards the closet door, whence she might soon have reached the chamber where she expected to find Flora and Dame Jacintha. Scarcely had she reached the middle of the room when the latch was lifted up a second time. An involuntary movement obliged her to turn her head. Slowly and gradually the door turned upon its hinges, and standing upon the threshold she beheld a tall, thin figure wrapped in a white shroud which covered it from head to foot. This vision arrested her feet. She remained as if petrified in the middle of the apartment. The stranger with measured and solemn steps drew near the table. The dying taper darted a blue and melancholy flame as the figure advanced towards it. Over the table was fixed a small clock, the hand of it was upon the stroke of 3. The figure stopped opposite to the clock. It raised its right arm and pointed to the hour, at the same time looking earnestly upon Antonia, who waited for the conclusion of this scene, motionless and silent. The figure remained in this posture for some moments. The clock struck. When the sound had ceased, the stranger advanced yet a few steps nearer Antonia. "Yet 3 days," said a voice faint, hollow, and sepulchral. "Yet 3 days, and we meet again." Antonia shuddered at the words. "We meet again?" she pronounced at length with difficulty. "Where shall we meet? Whom shall I meet?" The figure pointed to the ground with one hand, and with the other raised the linen which covered its face. "Almighty God, my mother!" Antonia shrieked, and fell lifeless upon the floor. Dame Jacintha, who was at work in a neighbouring chamber, was alarmed by the cry. Flora was just gone downstairs to fetch fresh oil for the lamp by which they had been sitting. Jacintha therefore hastened alone to Antonia's assistance, and great was her amazement to find her extended upon the floor. She raised her in her arms, conveyed her to her apartment, and placed her upon the bed still senseless. She then proceeded to bathe her temples, chafe her hands, and use all possible means of bringing her to herself. With some difficulty she succeeded. Antonia opened her eyes and looked round her wildly. "Where is she?" she cried in a trembling voice. "Is she gone? Am I safe? Speak to me, comfort me. Oh! Speak to me for God's sake." "Safe from whom, my child?" replied the astonished Jacintha. "What alarms you? Of whom are you afraid?" "In 3 days, she told me that we should meet in 3 days. I heard her say it. I saw her, Jacintha, I saw her. But this moment—" She threw herself upon Jacintha's bosom. "You saw her? Saw whom? My mother's ghost." "Christ Jesus!" cried Jacintha, and starting from the bed, let fall Antonia upon the pillow, and fled in consternation out of the room. As she hastened downstairs, she met Flora ascending them. "Go to your mistress, Flora," said she. "Here are rare doings. Oh, I am the most unfortunate woman alive. My house is filled with ghosts and dead bodies, and the Lord knows what besides, yet I am sure nobody likes such company less than I do. But go your way to Donna Antonia, Flora, and let me go mine." Thus saying, she continued her course to the street door, which she opened, and without allowing herself time to throw on her veil, she made the best of her way to the Capuchin Abbey. In the meanwhile, Flora hastened to her lady's chamber, equally surprised and alarmed at Jacintha's consternation. She found Antonia lying upon the bed insensible. She used the same means for her recovery that Jacintha had already employed, but finding that her mistress only recovered from one fit to fall into another, she sent in all haste for a physician. While expecting his arrival, she undressed Antonia and conveyed her to bed. Heedless of the storm, terrified almost out of her senses, Jacintha ran through the streets and stopped not till she reached the gate of the abbey. She rang loudly at the bell, and as soon as the porter appeared, she desired permission to speak to the superior. Ambrosio was then conferring with Matilda upon the means of procuring access to Antonia. The cause of Elvira's death remaining unknown, he was convinced that crimes were not so swiftly followed by punishment, as his instructors the monks had taught him, and as till then he had himself believed. This persuasion made him resolve upon Antonia's ruin, for the enjoyment of whose person dangers and difficulties only seemed to have increased his passion. The monk had already made one attempt to gain admission to her presence, but Flora had refused him in such a manner as to convince him that all future endeavours must be vain. Elvira had confided her suspicions to that trusty servant. She had desired her never to leave Ambrosio alone with her daughter, and if possible to prevent their meeting altogether. Flora promised to obey her, and had executed her orders to the very letter. Ambrosio's visit had been rejected that morning, though Antonia was ignorant of it. He saw that to obtain a sight of his mistress by open means was out of the question, and both himself and Matilda had consumed the night in endeavouring to invent some plan whose event might be more successful. Such was their employment, when a lay brother entered the abbot's cell and informed him that a woman calling herself Jacintha Zuniga requested audience for a few minutes. Ambrosio was by no means disposed to grant the petition of his visitor. He refused it positively, and bade the lay brother tell the stranger to return the next day. Matilda interrupted him. "See this woman," said she in a low voice. "I have my reasons." The abbot obeyed her, and signified that he would go to the parlour immediately. With this answer, the lay brother withdrew. As soon as they were alone, Ambrosio inquired why Matilda wished him to see this Jacintha. "She is Antonia's hostess," replied Matilda. "She may possibly be of use to you, but let us examine her and learn what brings her hither." They proceeded together to the parlour, where Jacintha was already waiting for the abbot. She had conceived a great opinion of his piety and virtue, and supposing him to have much influence over the devil, thought that it must be an easy matter for him to lay Elvira's ghost in the Red Sea. Filled with this persuasion, she had hastened to the abbey. As soon as she saw the monk enter the parlour, she dropped upon her knees and began her story as follows. "Oh, Reverend Father, such an accident, such an adventure! I know not what course to take, and unless you can help me, I shall certainly go distracted. Well, to be sure, never was woman so unfortunate as myself. All in my power to keep clear of such abomination have I done, and yet that all is too little. What signifies my telling my beads 4 times a day, and observing every fast prescribed by the calendar? What signifies my having made 3 pilgrimages to St. James of Compostela, and purchased as many pardons from the Pope as would buy off Cain's punishment? Nothing prospers with me. All goes wrong, and God only knows whether anything will ever go right again. Why now, be your holiness the judge, my lodger dies in convulsions. Out of pure kindness I bury her at my own expense. Not that she is any relation of mine, or that I shall be benefited a single pistole by her death. I got nothing by it, and therefore you know, Reverend Father, that her living or dying was just the same to me. But that is nothing to the purpose. To return to what I was saying. I took care of her funeral, had everything performed decently and properly, and put myself to expense enough, God knows. And how do you think the lady repays me for my kindness? Why, truly, by refusing to sleep quietly in her comfortable deal coffin, as a peaceable, well-disposed spirit ought to do, and coming to plague me, who never wished to set eyes on her again. Forsooth, it well becomes her to go racketing about my house at midnight, popping into her daughter's room through the keyhole, and frightening the poor child out of her wits. Though she be a ghost, she might be more civil than to bolt into a person's house, who likes her company so little. But as for me, Reverend Father, the plain state of the case is this: if she walks into my house, I must walk out of it, for I cannot abide such visitors, not I. Thus you see, your sanctity, that without your assistance I am ruined and undone for ever. I shall be obliged to quit my house, nobody will take it, when 'tis known that she haunts it, and then I shall find myself in a fine situation. Miserable woman that I am, what shall I do? What will become of me?" Here she wept bitterly, wrung her hands, and begged to know the abbot's opinion of her case. "In truth, good woman," replied he, "it will be difficult for me to relieve you without knowing what is the matter with you. You have forgotten to tell me what has happened, and what it is you want." "Let me die," cried Jacintha, "but your sanctity is in the right. This then is the fact stated briefly. A lodger of mine is lately dead, a very good sort of woman that I must needs say for her as far as my knowledge of her went, though that was not a great way. She kept me too much at a distance, for indeed she was given to be upon the high ropes, and whenever I ventured to speak to her, she had a look with her which always made me feel a little queerish. God forgive me for saying so. However, though she was more stately than needful, and affected to look down upon me, though, if I am well informed, I come of as good parents as she could do for her ears, for her father was a shoemaker at Cordova, and mine was an hatter at Madrid. Ay, and a very creditable hatter too, let me tell you. Yet for all her pride, she was a quiet, well-behaved body, and I never wished to have a better lodger. This makes me wonder the more at her not sleeping quietly in her grave, but there is no trusting to people in this world. For my part, I never saw her do amiss, except on the Friday before her death. To be sure, I was then much scandalized by seeing her eat the wing of a chicken. "How, Madonna Flora," quoth I. "Flora, may it please your reverence, is the name of the waiting maid." "How, Madonna Flora," quoth I, "does your mistress eat flesh upon Fridays?" Well, well, see the event, and then remember that Dame Jacintha warned you of it. These were my very words, but alas, I might as well have held my tongue. Nobody minded me, and Flora, who is somewhat pert and snappish, more is the pity, say I, told me that there was no more harm in eating a chicken than the egg from which it came. Nay, she even declared that if her lady added a slice of bacon, she would not be an inch nearer damnation, God protect us. A poor, ignorant, sinful soul, I protest to your holiness, I trembled to hear her utter such blasphemies, and expected every moment to see the ground open and swallow her up, chicken and all. For you must know, worshipful Father, that while she talked thus, she held the plate in her hand, on which lay the identical roast fowl, and a fine bird it was, that I must say for it. Done to a turn, for I superintended the cooking of it myself, It was a little Galician of my own raising, may it please your holiness, and the flesh was as white as an eggshell, as indeed Donna Elvira told me herself. Dame Jacintha, said she, very good-humouredly, though to say the truth, she was always very polite to me. Here Ambrosio's patience failed him. Eager to know Jacintha's business in which Antonia seemed to be concerned, he was almost distracted while listening to the rambling of this prosing old woman. He interrupted her and protested that if she did not immediately tell her story and have done with it, he should quit the parlour and leave her to get out of her difficulties by herself. This threat had the desired effect. Jacintha related her business in as few words as she could manage, but her account was still so prolix that Ambrosio had need of his patience to bear him to the conclusion. "And so, your reverence," said she, after relating Elvira's death and burial, with all their circumstances, "and so, your reverence, upon hearing the shriek, I put away my work, and away posted I to Donna Antonia's chamber. Finding nobody there, I passed on to the next, but I must own, I was a little timorous at going in, for this was the very room where Donna Elvira used to sleep. However, in I went, and sure enough, there lay the young lady at full length upon the floor, as cold as a stone, and as white as a sheet. I was surprised at this, as your holiness may well suppose, but oh me, how I shook when I saw a great tall figure at my elbow whose head touched the ceiling. The face was Donna Elvira's, I must confess, but out of its mouth came clouds of fire. Its arms were loaded with heavy chains which it rattled piteously, and every hair on its head was a serpent as big as my arm. At this I was frightened enough, and began to say my Ave, Maria, but the ghost interrupting me uttered 3 loud groans, and roared out in a terrible voice, "Oh! That chicken's wing! My poor soul suffers for it!" As soon as she had said this, the ground opened, the spectre sank down, I heard a clap of thunder, and the room was filled with the smell of brimstone. When I recovered from my fright, and had brought Donna Antonia to herself, who told me that she had cried out upon seeing her mother's ghost, and well might she cry, poor soul. Had I been in her place, I should have cried 10 times louder. It directly came into my head that if anyone had power to quiet this spectre, it must be your reverence. So hither I came in all diligence to beg that you will sprinkle my house with holy water and lay the apparition in the Red Sea." Ambrosio stared at this strange story, which he could not credit. "Did Donna Antonia also see the ghost?" said he, "as plain as I see you, Reverend Father?" Ambrosio paused for a moment. Here was an opportunity offered him of gaining access to Antonia, but he hesitated to employ it. The reputation which he enjoyed in Madrid was still dear to him, and since he had lost the reality of virtue, it appeared as if its semblance was become more valuable. He was conscious that publicly to break through the rule, never to quit the abbey precincts, would derogate much from his supposed austerity. In visiting Elvira, he had always taken care to keep his features concealed from the domestics. Except by the lady, her daughter, and the faithful Flora, he was known in the family by no other name than that of Father Jerome. Should he comply with Jacintha's request and accompany her to her house, he knew that the violation of his rule could not be kept a secret. However, his eagerness to see Antonia obtained the victory. He even hoped that the singularity of this adventure would justify him in the eyes of Madrid, but whatever might be the consequences, he resolved to profit by the opportunity which chance had presented to him. An expressive look from Matilda confirmed him in this resolution. "Good woman," said he to Jacintha, "what you tell me is so extraordinary that I can scarcely credit your assertions. However, I will comply with your request. Tomorrow, after matins, you may expect me at your house. I will then examine into what I can do for you, and if it is in my power, will free you from this unwelcome visitor. Now then, go home, and peace be with you." "Home?" exclaimed Jacintha. "I go home? Not I, by my troth. Except under your protection, I set no foot of mine within the threshold. God help me, the ghost may meet me upon the stairs, and whisk me away with her to the devil. Oh, that I had accepted young Melchior Basco's offer. Then I should have had somebody to protect me, but now I am a lone woman, and meet with nothing but crosses and misfortunes. Thank heaven, it is not yet too late to repent. There is Simon Gonzales will have me any day of the week, and if I live till daybreak, I will marry him out of hand, and husband I will have, that is determined, for now this ghost is once in my house, I shall be frightened out of my wits to sleep alone. But for God's sake, Reverend Father, come with me now. I shall have no rest till the house is purified, or the poor young lady either. The dear girl. She is in a piteous taking. I left her in strong convulsions, and I doubt she will not easily recover her fright." The friar started and interrupted her hastily. In convulsions, say you? Antonia in convulsions. Lead on, good woman. I follow you this moment. Jacintha insisted upon his stopping to furnish himself with the vessel of holy water. With this request he complied. Thinking herself safe under his protection should a legion of ghosts attack her, the old woman returned the monk a profusion of thanks, and they departed together for the Strada di San Iago. So strong an impression had the spectre made upon Antonia that for the first 2 or 3 hours the physician declared her life to be in danger. The fits at length becoming less frequent induced him to alter his opinion. He said that to keep her quiet was all that was necessary, and he ordered a medicine to be prepared which would tranquilize her nerves and procure her that repose which at present she much wanted. The sight of Ambrosio, who now appeared with Jacintha at her bedside, contributed essentially to compose her ruffled spirits. Elvira had not sufficiently explained herself upon the nature of his designs to make a girl so ignorant of the world as her daughter aware how dangerous was his acquaintance. At this moment, when penetrated with horror at the scene which had just passed, and dreading to contemplate the ghost's prediction, her mind had need of all the succours of friendship and religion. Antonia regarded the abbot with an eye doubly partial. That strong prepossession in his favour still existed which she had felt for him at first sight, she fancied, yet knew not wherefore that his presence was a safeguard to her from every danger, insult, or misfortune. She thanked him gratefully for his visit, and related to him the adventure which had alarmed her so seriously. The abbot strove to reassure her and convince her that the whole had been a deception of her overheated fancy. The solitude in which she had passed the evening, the gloom of night, the book which she had been reading, and the room in which she sat, were all calculated to place before her such a vision. He treated the idea of ghosts with ridicule, and produced strong arguments to prove the fallacy of such a system. His conversation tranquilized and comforted her, but did not convince her. She could not believe that the spectre had been a mere creature of her imagination. Every circumstance was impressed upon her mind too forcibly to permit her flattering herself with such an idea. She persisted in asserting that she had really seen her mother's ghost, had heard the period of her dissolution announced, and declared that she never should quit her bed alive. Ambrosio advised her against encouraging these sentiments, and then quitted her chamber, having promised to repeat his visit on the morrow. Antonia received this assurance with every mark of joy, but the monk easily perceived that he was not equally acceptable to her attendant. Flora obeyed Elvira's injunctions with the most scrupulous observance. She examined every circumstance with an anxious eye, likely in the least to prejudice her young mistress, to whom she had been attached for many years. She was a native of Cuba, had followed Elvira to Spain, and loved the young Antonia with a mother's affection. Flora quitted not the room for a moment while the abbot remained there. She watched his every word, his every look, his every action. He saw that her suspicious eye was always fixed upon him, and conscious that his designs would not bear inspection so minute, he felt frequently confused and disconcerted. He was aware that she doubted the purity of his intentions, that she would never leave him alone with Antonia, and his mistress defended by the presence of this vigilant observer, he despaired of finding the means to gratify his passion. As he quitted the house, Jacintha met him, and begged that some masses might be sung for the repose of Elvira's soul, which she doubted not was suffering in purgatory. He promised not to forget her request, but he perfectly gained the old woman's heart by engaging to watch during the whole of the approaching night in the haunted chamber. Jacintha could find no terms sufficiently strong to express her gratitude, and the monk departed loaded with her benedictions. It was broad day when he returned to the abbey. His first care was to communicate what had passed to his confidant. He felt too sincere a passion for Antonia to have heard unmoved the prediction of her speedy death, and he shuddered at the idea of losing an object so dear to him. Upon this head Matilda reassured him. She confirmed the arguments which himself had already used. She declared Antonia to have been deceived by the wandering of her brain, by the spleen which oppressed her at the moment, and by the natural turn of her mind to superstition and the marvellous. As to Jacintha's account, the absurdity refuted itself. The abbot hesitated not to believe that she had fabricated the whole story, either confused by terror or hoping to make him comply more readily with her request. Having overruled the monk's apprehensions, Matilda continued thus. The prediction and the ghost are equally false, but it must be your care, Ambrosio, to verify the first. Antonia, within 3 days, must indeed be dead to the world, but she must live for you. Her present illness, and this fancy which she has taken into her head, will colour a plan which I have long meditated, but which was impracticable without your procuring access to Antonia. She shall be yours, not for a single night, but forever. All the vigilance of her duenna shall not avail her, you shall riot unrestrained in the charms of your mistress. This very day must the scheme be put in execution, for you have no time to lose. The nephew of the Duke of Medinaceli prepares to demand Antonia for his bride. In a few days she will be removed to the palace of her relation, the Marquis de las Cisternas, and there she will be secure from your attempts. Thus during your absence have I been informed by my spies, who are ever employed in bringing me intelligence for your service. Now then, listen to me. There is a juice extracted from certain herbs, known but to few, which brings on the person who drinks it the exact image of death. Let this be administered to Antonia. You may easily find means to pour a few drops into her medicine. The effect will be throwing her into strong convulsions for an hour, after which her blood will gradually cease to flow and heart to beat. A mortal paleness will spread itself over her features, and she will appear a corpse to every eye. She has no friends about her. You may charge yourself unsuspected with the superintendence of her funeral, and cause her to be buried in the vaults of Stainclair. Their solitude and easy access render these caverns favourable to your designs. Give Antonia the soporific draught this evening. 48 hours after she has drank it, life will revive to her bosom. She will then be absolutely in your power. She will find all resistance unavailing, and necessity will compel her to receive you in her arms. Antonia will be in my power, exclaimed the monk. Matilda, you transport me. At length, then, happiness will be mine, and that happiness will be Matilda's gift, will be the gift of friendship. I shall clasp Antonia in my arms, far from every prying eye, from every tormenting intruder. I shall sigh out my soul upon her bosom, shall teach her young heart the first rudiments of pleasure, and revel uncontrolled in the endless variety of her charms. And shall this delight indeed be mine? Shall I give the reins to my desires, and gratify every wild, tumultuous wish? O Matilda, how can I express to you my gratitude? By profiting by my counsels. Ambrosio, I live but to serve you. Your interest and happiness are equally mine. Be your person Antonia's. But to your friendship and your heart I still assert my claim. Contributing to yours forms now my only pleasure. Should my exertions procure the gratification of your wishes, I shall consider my trouble to be amply repaid. But let us lose no time. The liquor of which I spoke is only to be found in Stainclair's laboratory. Hasten then to the prioress, request of her admission to the laboratory, and it will not be denied. There is a closet at the lower end of the great room, filled with liquids of different colours and qualities. The bottle in question stands by itself upon the third shelf on the left. It contains a greenish liquor. Fill a small phial with it when you are unobserved, and Antonia is your own. The monk hesitated not to adopt this infamous plan. His desires, but too violent before, had acquired fresh vigour from the sight of Antonia. As he sat by her bedside, accident had discovered to him some of those charms which till then had been concealed from him. He found them even more perfect than his ardent imagination had pictured them. Sometimes her white and polished arm was displayed in arranging the pillow, sometimes a sudden movement discovered part of her swelling bosom, but wherever the new-found charm presented itself, there rested the friar's gloating eyes. Scarcely could he master himself sufficiently to conceal his desires from Antonia and her vigilant duenna. Inflamed by the remembrance of these beauties, he entered into Matilda's scheme without hesitation. No sooner were matins over than he bent his course towards the convent of Stainclair. His arrival threw the whole sisterhood into the utmost amazement. The prioress was sensible of the honour done her convent by his paying it, his first visit, and strove to express her gratitude by every possible attention. He was paraded through the garden, shown all the relics of saints and martyrs, and treated with as much respect and distinction as had he been the Pope himself. On his part, Ambrosio received the dominar's civilities very graciously, and strove to remove her surprise at his having broken through his resolution. He stated that among his penitents, illness prevented many from quitting their houses. These were exactly the people who most needed his advice and the comforts of religion. Many representations had been made to him upon this account, and though highly repugnant to his own wishes, he had found it absolutely necessary for the service of heaven to change his determination and quit his beloved retirement. The prioress applauded his zeal in his profession and his charity towards mankind. She declared that Madrid was happy in possessing a man so perfect and irreproachable. In such discourse, the friar at length reached the laboratory. He found the closet, the bottle stood in the place which Matilda had described, and the monk seized an opportunity to fill his phial unobserved with the soporific liquor. Then, having partaken of a collation in the refectory, he retired from the convent pleased with the success of his visit, and leaving the nuns delighted by the honour conferred upon them. He waited till evening before he took the road to Antonia's dwelling. Jacintha welcomed him with transport, and besought him not to forget his promise to pass the night in the haunted chamber. That promise he now repeated. He found Antonia tolerably well, but still harping upon the ghost's prediction. Flora moved not from her lady's bed, and by symptoms yet stronger than on the former night testified her dislike to the abbot's presence. Still Ambrosio affected not to observe them. The physician arrived while he was conversing with Antonia. It was dark already, lights were called for, and Flora was compelled to descend for them herself. However, as she left a third person in the room, and expected to be absent but a few minutes, she believed that she risked nothing in quitting her post. No sooner had she left the room than Ambrosio moved towards the table on which stood Antonia's medicine. It was placed in a recess of the window. The physician, seated in an armchair and employed in questioning his patient, paid no attention to the proceedings of the monk. Ambrosio seized the opportunity. He drew out the fatal phial and let a few drops fall into the medicine. He then hastily left the table and returned to the seat which he had quitted. When Flora made her appearance with lights, everything seemed to be exactly as she had left it. The physician declared that Antonia might quit her chamber the next day with perfect safety. He recommended her following the same prescription which, on the night before, had procured her a refreshing sleep. Flora replied that the draught stood ready upon the table. He advised the patient to take it without delay, and then retired. Flora poured the medicine into a cup and presented it to her mistress. At that moment Ambrosio's courage failed him. Might not Matilda have deceived him? Might not jealousy have persuaded her to destroy her rival and substitute poison in the room of an opiate? This idea appeared so reasonable that he was on the point of preventing her from swallowing the medicine. His resolution was adopted too late. The cup was already emptied, and Antonia restored it into Flora's hands. No remedy was now to be found. Ambrosio could only expect the moment impatiently, destined to decide upon Antonia's life or death, upon his own happiness or despair. Dreading to create suspicion by his stay, or betray himself by his mind's agitation, he took leave of his victim and withdrew from the room. Antonia parted from him with less cordiality than on the former night. Flora had represented to her mistress that to admit his visits was to disobey her mother's orders. She described to her his emotion on entering the room and the fire which sparkled in his eyes while he gazed upon her. This had escaped Antonia's observation, but not her attendants, who, explaining the monk's designs and their probable consequences in terms much clearer than Elvira's, though not quite so delicate, had succeeded in alarming her young lady and persuading her to treat him more distantly than she had done hitherto. The idea of obeying her mother's will at once determined Antonia. Though she grieved at losing his society, she conquered herself sufficiently to receive the monk with some degree of reserve and coldness. She thanked him with respect and gratitude for his former visits, but did not invite his repeating them in future. It now was not the friar's interest to solicit admission to her presence, and he took leave of her as if not designing to return. Fully persuaded that the acquaintance which she dreaded was now at an end, Flora was so much worked upon by his easy compliance that she began to doubt the justice of her suspicions. As she lighted him downstairs, she thanked him for having endeavoured to root out from Antonia's mind her superstitious terrors of the spectre's prediction. She added that as he seemed interested in Donna Antonia's welfare, should any change take place in her situation, she would be careful to let him know it. The monk in replying took pains to raise his voice, hoping that Jacintha would hear it. In this he succeeded. As he reached the foot of the stairs with his conductress, the landlady failed not to make her appearance. "Why, surely you are not going away, reverend father," cried she. "Did you not promise to pass the night in the haunted chamber? Christ Jesus, I shall be left alone with the ghost, and a fine pickle I shall be in by morning. Do all I could, say all I could, that obstinate old brute, Simon Gonzales, refused to marry me today, and before tomorrow comes, I suppose, I shall be torn to pieces by the ghosts and goblins and devils and what not. For God's sake, your holiness, do not leave me in such a woeful condition. On my bended knees I beseech you to keep your promise. Watch this night in the haunted chamber, lay the apparition in the Red Sea, and Jacintha remembers you in her prayers to the last day of her existence." This request Ambrosio expected and desired. yet he affected to raise objections and to seem unwilling to keep his word. He told Jacintha that the ghost existed nowhere but in her own brain, and that her insisting upon his staying all night in the house was ridiculous and useless. Jacintha was obstinate, she was not to be convinced, and pressed him so urgently not to leave her a prey to the devil that at length he granted her request. All this show of resistance imposed not upon Flora, who was naturally of a suspicious temper. She suspected the monk to be acting a part very contrary to his own inclinations, and that he wished for no better than to remain where he was. She even went so far as to believe that Jacintha was in his interest, and the poor old woman was immediately set down as no better than a procuress. While she applauded herself for having penetrated into this plot against her lady's honour, she resolved in secret to render it fruitless. "So then," said she to the abbot with a look half satirical and half indignant, "so then you mean to stay here tonight? Do so in God's name, nobody will prevent you. Sit up to watch for the ghost's arrival, I shall sit up too, and the Lord grant that I may see nothing worse than a ghost. I quit not Donna Antonia's bedside during this blessed night. Let me see anyone dare to enter the room, and be he mortal or immortal, be he ghost, devil or man, I warrant his repenting that ever he crossed the threshold." This hint was sufficiently strong, and Ambrosio understood its meaning. But instead of showing that he perceived her suspicions, he replied mildly that he approved the duenna's precautions and advised her to persevere in her intention. This she assured him faithfully that he might depend upon her doing. Jacintha then conducted him into the chamber where the ghost had appeared, and Flora returned to her ladies. Jacintha opened the door of the haunted room with a trembling hand. She ventured to peep in, but the wealth of India would not have tempted her to cross the threshold. She gave the taper to the monk, wished him well through the adventure, and hastened to be gone. Ambrosio entered. He bolted the door, placed the light upon the table, and seated himself in the chair which on the former night had sustained Antonia. In spite of Matilda's assurances that the spectre was a mere creation of fancy, his mind was impressed with a certain mysterious horror. He in vain endeavoured to shake it off. The silence of the night, the story of the apparition, the chamber wainscoted with dark oak panels, the recollection which it brought with it of the murdered Elvira, and his incertitude respecting the nature of the drops given by him to Antonia, made him feel uneasy at his present situation. But he thought much less of the spectre than of the poison. Should he have destroyed the only object which rendered life dear to him, should the ghost's prediction prove true, should Antonia in 3 days be no more, and he the wretched cause of her death, the supposition was too horrible to dwell upon. He drove away these dreadful images, and as often they presented themselves again before him. Matilda had assured him that the effects of the opiate would be speedy. He listened with fear, yet with eagerness, expecting to hear some disturbance in the adjoining chamber. All was still silent. He concluded that the drops had not begun to operate. Great was the stake for which he now played, a moment would suffice to decide upon his misery or happiness. Matilda had taught him the means of ascertaining that life was not extinct for ever. Upon this assay depended all his hopes. With every instant his impatience redoubled, his terrors grew more lively, his anxiety more awake. Unable to bear this state of incertitude, he endeavoured to divert it by substituting the thoughts of others to his own. The books, as was before mentioned, were ranged upon shelves near the table. This stood exactly opposite to the bed, which was placed in an alcove near the closet door. Ambrosio took down a volume and seated himself by the table, but his attention wandered from the pages before him. Antonia's image and that of the murdered Elvira persisted to force themselves before his imagination. Still he continued to read, though his eyes ran over the characters without his mind being conscious of their import. Such was his occupation, when he fancied that he heard a footstep. He turned his head, but nobody was to be seen. He resumed his book, but in a few minutes after the same sound was repeated, and followed by a rustling noise close behind him. He now started from his seat, and looking round him, perceived the closet door standing half unclosed. On his first entering the room he had tried to open it, but found it bolted on the inside. "How is this?" said he to himself. "How comes this door unfastened?" He advanced towards it, he pushed it open, and looked into the closet. No one was there. While he stood irresolute, he thought that he distinguished a groaning in the adjacent chamber. It was Antonia's, and he supposed that the drops began to take effect. But upon listening more attentively, he found the noise to be caused by Jacintha, who had fallen asleep by the lady's bedside, and was snoring most lustily. Ambrosio drew back and returned to the other room, musing upon the sudden opening of the closet door, for which he strove in vain to account. He paced the chamber up and down in silence. At length he stopped, and the bed attracted his attention. The curtain of the recess was but half drawn. He sighed involuntarily. "That bed," said he in a low voice, "that bed was Elvira's. There has she passed many a quiet night, for she was good and innocent. How sound must have been her sleep! And yet now she sleeps sounder. Does she indeed sleep? Oh, God grant that she may! What if she rose from her grave at this sad and silent hour? What if she broke the bonds of the tomb and blinded angrily before my blasted eyes? Oh, I never could support the sight, again to see her form distorted by dying agonies, her blood-swollen veins, her livid countenance, her eyes bursting from their sockets with pain. To hear her speak of future punishment, menace me with heaven's vengeance, tax me with the crimes I have committed, with those I am going to commit. Great God, what is that?" As he uttered these words, his eyes, which were fixed upon the bed, saw the curtain shaken gently backwards and forwards. The apparition was recalled to his mind, and he almost fancied that he beheld Elvira's visionary form reclining upon the bed. A few moments' consideration sufficed to reassure him. "It was only the wind," said he, recovering himself. Again he paced the chamber, but an involuntary movement of awe and inquietude constantly led his eye towards the alcove. He drew near it with irresolution. He paused before he ascended the few steps which led to it. He put out his hand thrice to remove the curtain, and as often drew it back. "Absurd terrors!" he cried at length, ashamed of his own weakness. Hastily he mounted the steps, when a figure dressed in white started from the alcove, and gliding by him, made with precipitation towards the closet. Madness and despair now supplied the monk with that courage of which he had till then been destitute. He flew down the steps, pursued the apparition, and attempted to grasp it. "Ghost or devil, I hold you!" he exclaimed, and seized the spectre by the arm. "Oh, Christ Jesus!" cried a shrill voice. "Holy Father, how you gripe me! I protest that I meant no harm." This address, as well as the arm which he held, convinced the abbot that the supposed ghost was substantial flesh and blood. He drew the intruder towards the table, and holding up the light, discovered the features of Madonna Flora. Incensed at having been betrayed by this trifling cause into fears so ridiculous, he asked her sternly what business had brought her to that chamber. Flora, ashamed at being found out, and terrified at the severity of Ambrosio's looks, fell upon her knees and promised to make a full confession. "I protest, Reverend Father," said she, "that I am quite grieved at having disturbed you. Nothing was further from my intention. I meant to get out of the room as quietly as I got in, and had you been ignorant that I watched you, it would have been the same thing as if I had not watched you at all. To be sure, I did very wrong in being a spy upon you, that I cannot deny, but Lord, your reverence, how can a poor weak woman resist curiosity? Mine was so strong to know what you were doing that I could not but try to get a little peep, without anybody knowing anything about it. So with that I left old Dame Jacintha sitting by my lady's bed, and I ventured to steal into the closet. Being unwilling to interrupt you, I contented myself at first with putting my eye to the keyhole, but as I could see nothing by this means, I undrew the bolt, and while your back was turned to the alcove, I whipped me in softly and silently. Here I lay snug behind the curtain, till your reverence found me out, and seized me ere I had time to regain the closet door. This is the whole truth, I assure you, Holy Father, and I beg your pardon 1,000 times for my impertinence." During this speech, the abbot had time to recollect himself. He was satisfied with reading The Penitent Spy, a lecture upon the dangers of curiosity, and the meanness of the action in which she had been just discovered. Flora declared herself fully persuaded that she had done wrong. She promised never to be guilty of the same fault again, and was retiring very humble and contrite to Antonia's chamber, when the closet door was suddenly thrown open, and in rushed Jacintha, pale and out of breath. "Oh, Father! Father!" she cried in a voice almost choked with terror. "What shall I do? What shall I do? Here is a fine piece of work, nothing but misfortunes, nothing but dead people and dying people. Oh, I shall go distracted, I shall go distracted. Speak, speak," cried Flora and the monk at the same time. "What has happened?" "What is the matter? Oh, I shall have another course in my house. Some witch has certainly cast a spell upon it, upon me, and upon all about me. Poor Donna Antonia. There she lies in just such convulsions as killed her mother. The ghost told her true. I am sure the ghost has told her true. Flora ran, or rather flew to her lady's chamber. Ambrosio followed her, his bosom trembling with hope and apprehension. They found Antonia as Jacintha had described, torn by racking convulsions from which they in vain endeavoured to relieve her. The monk dispatched Jacintha to the abbey in all haste, and commissioned her to bring Father Pablos back with her, without losing a moment. "I will go for him," replied Jacintha, "and tell him to come hither. But as to bringing him myself, I shall do no such thing. I am sure that the house is bewitched, and burn me if ever I set foot in it again." With this resolution she set out for the monastery, and delivered to Father Pablos the abbot's orders. She then betook herself to the house of old Simon Gonzales, whom she resolved never to quit till she had made him her husband, and his dwelling her own. Father Pablos had no sooner beheld Antonia than he pronounced her incurable. The convulsions continued for an hour. During that time her agonies were much milder than those which her groans created in the abbot's heart. Her every pang seemed a dagger in his bosom, and he cursed himself 1,000 times for having adopted so barbarous a project. The hour being expired, by degrees the fits became less frequent, and Antonia less agitated. She felt that her dissolution was approaching, and that nothing could save her. "Worthy Ambrosio," she said in a feeble voice, while she pressed his hand to her lips, "I am now at liberty to express how grateful is my heart for your attention and kindness. I am upon the bed of death yet an hour, and I shall be no more. I may therefore acknowledge without restraint that to relinquish your society was very painful to me, but such was the will of a parent, and I dared not disobey. I die without repugnance. There are few who will lament my leaving them. There are few whom I lament to leave. Among those few, I lament for none more than for yourself. But we shall meet again, Ambrosio. We shall one day meet in heaven. There shall our friendship be renewed, and my mother shall view it with pleasure." She paused. The abbot shuddered when she mentioned Elvira. Antonia imputed his emotion to pity and concern for her. "You are grieved for me, father," she continued. "Ah, sigh not for my loss. I have no crimes to repent, at least none of which I am conscious, and I restore my soul without fear to him from whom I received it. I have but few requests to make, yet let me hope that what few I have shall be granted. Let a solemn mass be said for my soul's repose, and another for that of my beloved mother. Not that I doubt her resting in her grave. I am now convinced that my reason wandered, and the falsehood of the ghost's prediction is sufficient to prove my error. But everyone has some failing. My mother may have had hers, though I knew them not. I therefore wish a mass to be celebrated for her repose, and the expense may be defrayed by the little wealth of which I am possessed. Whatever may then remain, I bequeath to my Aunt Leonela. When I am dead, let the Marquis de las Cisternas know that his brother's unhappy family can no longer importune him. But disappointment makes me unjust. They tell me that he is ill, and perhaps had it been in his power, he wished to have protected me. Tell him then, father, only that I am dead, and that if he had any faults to me, I forgave him from my heart. This done, I have nothing more to ask for than your prayers. Promise to remember my requests, and I shall resign my life without a pang or sorrow." Ambrosio engaged to comply with her desires, and proceeded to give her absolution. Every moment announced the approach of Antonia's fate. Her sight failed, her heart beat sluggishly, her fingers stiffened and grew cold, and at 2 in the morning she expired without a groan. As soon as the breath had forsaken her body, Father Pablos retired, sincerely affected at the melancholy scene. In her part, Flora gave way to the most unbridled sorrow. Far different concerns employed Ambrosio. He sought for the pulse whose throbbing, so Matilda had assured him, would prove Antonia's death but temporal. He found it, he pressed it, it palpitated beneath his hand, and his heart was filled with ecstasy. However, he carefully concealed his satisfaction at the success of his plan. He assumed a melancholy air, and addressing himself to Flora, warned her against abandoning herself to fruitless sorrow. Her tears were too sincere to permit her listening to his counsels, and she continued to weep unceasingly. And the friar withdrew, first promising to give orders himself about the funeral, which, out of consideration for Jacintha as he pretended, should take place with all expedition. Plunged in grief for the loss of her beloved mistress, Flora scarcely attended to what he said. Ambrosio hastened to command the burial. He obtained permission from the prioress that the corse should be deposited in Stainclair's sepulchre, and on the Friday morning, every proper and needful ceremony being performed, Antonia's body was committed to the tomb. On the same day, Leonela arrived at Madrid, intending to present her young husband to Elvira. Various circumstances had obliged her to defer her journey from Tuesday to Friday, and she had no opportunity of making this alteration in her plans known to her sister. As her heart was truly affectionate, and as she had ever entertained a sincere regard for Elvira and her daughter, her surprise at hearing of their sudden and melancholy fate was fully equalled by her sorrow and disappointment. Ambrosio sent to inform her of Antonia's bequest. At her solicitation, he promised, as soon as Elvira's trifling debts were discharged, to transmit to her the remainder. This being settled, no other business detained Leonela in Madrid, and she returned to Cordova with all diligence.